A great philosopher once said, "Death is the beginning of a new life." And now, for Moon Campbell, these words took on a new meaning. After all, this phrase played out in his real life, and not just as a philosophical saying. He had experienced all of the above firsthand. He had died, but was reborn into a new life. It was such a classic way for these stories, that it could even be called old-fashioned, but it was a reliable scenario. Moon remembered every minute of his death, especially the girl who played the leading role in it. It seemed like it was just another ordinary day at work as a truck driver, with nothing to foreshadow trouble. But here he was, crashing into a wall to save a girl with a cat, giving his life in exchange for two. Thus, a simple driver became Moon Campbell, the main character of a novel he had always enjoyed reading in his past life. A middle-aged corporate slave who barely made ends meet became the only son of Campbell the Lionheart, one of the 4 great dukes of the empire. He became the son of loving parents, who were second only to the emperor in power and loved him madly. Our hero remembered by heart that the novel also featured a 3rd princess, a pure child and queen of ice. She was also his future wife. The novel also featured the incredibly beautiful Black Witch of Santa Maria, president of the Society of Ancient Potions and librarian. She was his beloved older sister, with whom he could always relax, lay his head on her lap, and surrender to the moment. This story also featured someone who could compete for the title of the strongest person in the world. A girl with snow-white hair and scarlet eyes, Moon Campbell's teacher. What could be better? By giving up his old life, the boy got a new one that seemed 100 times better, where he had money, power, and beautiful girls. It seemed that he was not a man, but a winner in life. He thought so until one moment, when he realized that he was not the main character in this story. And he said this as someone who had been following the novel for 2 years. And he remembered that there was a main character, and she was a woman. Who is Moon Campbell? Just a handsome blonde villain, just his parents' son, or one of those jerks who inevitably appear on the path of the hero's development, and of course, create problems. Or maybe all of the above. But the main problem is that the prophecy in this book does not allow him to change his fate. Otherwise, he will die even faster. He didn't like the story he was supposed to follow. He wanted to create his own, and if that didn't work, he would be forced to use his trump card. He decided to just go out with a bang if he couldn't change anything. He realized that the ship was already sinking, so let him enjoy the life of a young nobleman before his inevitable death. Did he have a beautiful maid with straight black hair? And was she 5 feet 9 inches? Who would want to ask him out? For some reason, this desirable thought made him laugh, as if to say, what nonsense had he come up with? He found himself in the body of a thug hated by the entire empire. Who would love such a person, even for money and beauty? He was so deep in thought that he didn't even notice the maid coming in, which caught him off guard. Moon's thoughts seemed to have come true. Standing before him was a beautiful woman with black hair and long legs, who confessed that she liked him. No matter how hard the young gentleman tried to hide his embarrassment, it was obvious. But in reality, he didn't even expect the fruit of his imagination to exist. Admittedly, it would have been strange if everything had gone according to the scenario in his head. And yet, the maid's feelings for her master were not so simple. To show the seriousness of her intentions, the brunette bound her master in metal chains. Then in a soft, languid voice, she confessed that it was love. Without any embarrassment, she continued to say that she was ready to fulfill any desires, even erotic ones. Approaching the young master unacceptably close, she said that she needed to destroy all the insects that surrounded him. The girl was very possessive. She was not shy about taking matters into her own hands, even though she was lower in status. She believed that the gentleman should belong only to her. She did not hesitate to express this with vulgar gestures, whether it was a dream or the day had already passed. We are back at the Campbell family castle, where young Mr. Campbell was still trying to adapt to his new role in life. Every time he woke up, he remembered his death in the accident, and wondered if what was happening to him now was just a normal journey through time. After all, he was surrounded by a palace with Western-style interiors and furniture that not every ordinary person could afford. And when he looked at himself in the mirror, he saw a young man whose face looked 17 or 18 years old. Therefore, he sometimes panicked when he did not understand what was happening to him and where he had ended up. In his youth, he was such a handsome man, which was well recreated. Therefore, he continued to theorize that perhaps he was in some kind of game world. If you think about it more abstractly, he had been transported to another dimension with the help of a truck. Maybe these were his middle-aged death fantasies? In any case, what's the point of guessing? You have to take matters into your own hands and check. And a small scratch on his finger from the blade wouldn't hurt him at all. Yes, it was very painful, The blade was too sharp and proved that everything was real, not some kind of dream. But this realization did not make him feel any better. If he was Moon Campbell, then according to the script, he became someone who insulted the ruling family and was subsequently stripped of his status and demoted to a commoner. But his crime was unforgivable, and as a result, he was sentenced to exile. He no longer wore the finely tailored suits that had adorned his body. Now he had only an old, torn cloak and the attitude to match. No one wanted to see him, and if he had remained in the Empire, he could have been executed. Our hero did not lose hope until the very end, and kept thinking that maybe they just had the same name. But the realization turned out to be sad. His soul ended up in the body of a crazy playboy with golden hair, who could not even be called an elite villain. The Strongest Heroine in History was a popular novel in the hero's past life. He read it literally every day. Moon Campbell was a brainless villain. He used his family's power to torment the heroine, constantly sending assassins after her, thereby giving her group experience. In the end, his schemes were exposed. Problems engulfed the entire ducal family. Moon was exiled to the border and became destitute. After the 20th chapter, no one even remembered him. He could have become a worthy young gentleman, but he was busy with nonsense and met a stupid death. The guy was puzzled. He was stressed, because he didn't understand why he wasn't made the main character, why he became a jerk who would only be a stepping stone on the main character's path. He could have sat there for a long time thinking about what would be better, what would be worse, and what he should do in general. But a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was the Campbell family's maid, a girl named Anne. She came to report that the outfit for tomorrow's banquet had been delivered, and that the lady had asked for it to be given to her son to try on. For some reason, Anne felt sad when the young master asked her to leave the outfit in another part of the room. But in fact, she noticed that her master had injured himself, so she showed concern. Moon wanted to ask for some bandages or other means to stop the bleeding, but the girl had other plans. She had no idea what kind of bandage the young man was talking about, but she knew other, less obvious but effective methods of stopping the bleeding. Kneeling down to get closer to her master's hand, Anne licked all the blood off with her tongue. Moon had an ambiguous reaction because he did not expect this from a maid at all. But even so, he did not stop her. Now not a single drop of the young master's precious blood was lost. The girl, leaning over his wounded body with trembling lips, carefully licked up the scarlet drops, as if trying to absorb every particle of his life force. Her heart beat in time with his weakening pulse. She couldn't let him disappear. It was a brave act on the girl's part, but she remained confident. She even wished for the young master to take care of himself. Moon still couldn't get over Anne's actions, and like a good boy, he simply said that he would remember it and thanked her for her help. The girl had to return to work, and since everything was fine with the gentleman, she left. The color had not left the young gentleman's face. Moreover, his hands were still shaking from excitement. It was a bouquet of different feelings that he managed to experience in a matter of seconds. From incomprehension to the happiness of the moment. Moon rocked back and forth on the bed like a boy who had kissed a girl for the first time and felt love, even though everything was completely different. But it seemed that Anne was also confused. She stood behind the door and tried to digest what had happened. After all, the young gentleman had just thanked her. Moon returned to his previous question. He was the son of a duke with good looks, lots of money, power, and such a beautiful maid. Why did he provoke the main character in the novel? He remembered that the reason for his expulsion would be the drug mixed into the third princess's coming-of-age ceremony. This problem could be avoided if you knew about it. Maybe all was not lost. Maybe he could still change Moon's fate by remaining a rich young gentleman. The guy thought about the upcoming ceremony and remembered the reason why Anne came. That fateful ceremony was tomorrow, which completely dampened Moon's enthusiasm. He fell into despair. He needed some kind of support. He tried to summon the system, his grandfather, some kind of god or a monk. But he was alone. So far, he couldn't find any cheats that the main characters usually got. Yes, he had drawn 5 golden tickets out of 10 attempts in his past life, but that was no reason to abandon him here. The ceremony was coming up tomorrow, and Moon didn't know if he could smooth over past grievances with apologies. He hoped she wouldn't suggest any crazy ideas, like licking her feet in public. And yet Moon considered himself a real man who was capable of bending to anyone. And it would be a trifle if he didn't have to become a beggar. He was ready to go through even that, as long as she was in black stockings. The decision had already been made. Moon was ready to run to her, fall to his knees at the speed of light, and bow 3 times. This brilliant idea was accompanied by pain in his light-colored head. It was quite painful, and he didn't understand where it came from or what had hit him on the head. While lying on his bed, he noticed a book lying slightly to the side, as if someone had left it there on purpose. With a luxurious dark blue cover and elegant patterns, the book lay quietly on the soft folds of the bed. Moon happily guessed that his cheat codes had arrived. His trembling hands held the small book. He hadn't opened it yet, but he was already sure that it would really help him. Moon shed a tear of joy, because it meant that God had not abandoned him. Yes, he was still cannon fodder, but now he had the cheats, and that was a different matter. He did not lose hope of changing the plot and challenging fate. After all, he had to take matters into his own hands. But what a surprise he got when he finally decided to open the book. The book was completely blank. There was nothing on the pages, not a single line. Moon wondered if there was some way to activate it. It was set in Western Europe, which he knew little about. Such emotional swings caused blood to flow from his wounds. Lost in thought, he didn't notice when a drop of his blood fell onto the empty page of the book. Black smoke enveloped the entire book and slowly made its way towards Moon. It grew larger and larger, which undoubtedly frightened the main character. But not only that, his blood continued to flow. The book seemed to suck it out of him, as if feeding its pages. Moon lost consciousness and found himself in a dark room, half naked and bound in shackles that prevented him from even moving. His body and face were beaten, and he felt discomfort when he tried to open his eyes. All this time, someone was watching him, and immediately noticed the awakening of his captive. The girl had been waiting a long time for him to wake up. When Moon made a futile attempt to move, he felt pain in every millimeter of his body. The stranger understood this, so she made it clear to Moon that the pain was necessary to teach him a lesson. Moon had no idea how sad the stranger was. This should not have happened to him. He should blame his anger, cruelty, and selfishness. The young gentleman was supposed to cause pain to others, not suffer it himself. He was supposed to make everyone hate him. Then he would belong to her. But Moon's heart had changed, and that was a problem. Even so, the stranger had no intention of giving up on her feelings. On the contrary, she was convinced that she could change the young gentleman with her love, no matter how long it took. Only then, after overcoming all trials and accomplishing their plan, would they finally be able to be together forever. And after that, even death itself would not dare to stand between them and would not be able to separate them. Chains, shackles, knives, and everything was gone. There was no girl nearby. Only Moon. He tried to catch his breath and understand what had just happened. It was probably a dream or some kind of vision, but the young man still felt pain on his skin. It was too realistic for an ordinary dream. This strange book flipped through the pages like crazy and took a lot of his blood, and then he just passed out. If the book was indeed some kind of cheat, could it be assumed that it showed the guy the consequences of his mistake in changing the plot? This darkness that had crashed into his head kept telling him not to try to change his destiny. Moon got a warning, and it seemed that he would meet his end anyway, even if he tried to interfere with the course of events. He was mistaking his desires for reality. The only way to survive was on the path to destruction. Suddenly, it dawned on him that the original plot wasn't so bad. He didn't remember Moon's death being mentioned there. That useless nobleman's son had no life skills, so he became a vagrant. But our hero is different. In his past life, he was a warrior on the labor front who had gone through thousands of trials of modern society. If Moon quickly disappeared from the plot, he would be able to start a new life after his exile. All he had to do was use the wisdom of modern people. There was no point in clinging to the status of an aristocrat. It was just a privilege to exploit workers. A worker's front warrior can always earn a living with his own hands and knowledge. It was time to blend into the aristocratic life of Moon Campbell. He ate delicious meat and washed it down with a glass of wine. It was the most delicious food he had ever tasted. Everything smelled very appetizing, and if he could, he would have eaten everything. His mother, Duchess Noyce Campbell, noticed that something had changed in her son. She hadn't seen him so happy in a long time. His father, Duke Leopold Ron Campbell, assumed that such joy was connected with the upcoming banquet, because it was one of the most important events in Moon's life. Moon, looking happy, admitted that this was indeed the case and that he was eagerly awaiting the banquet. Mom couldn't help but rejoice at the thought of how much attention Moon would attract, especially from girls. But she had to remember that Moon already had a fiancé, and it would be difficult to explain to Princess Celia if she became jealous. His father was quite pleased with the match his son had found, but his mother did not like Celia. She seemed too cold, unkind, and unworthy of Moon. Moon himself was moved by how much his parents believed in him. But he couldn't remember who Celia was. The third princess of the empire was a pure child, blessed by God. She was also one of the candidates for the title of most beautiful woman in the country. In our hero's past life, this princess had a crowd of fans, attracted by the contrast between her cold appearance and her warm personality hidden behind the facade. Celia was always the center of attention. But what about Moon? Just a rotten fish, as his parents still didn't understand him and considered him the best treasure in the world. Leopold Ron Campbell and Noyce Campbell were good people and wonderful parents. But they would be forced to leave high society after the incident at the ceremony that Moon would cause. The book claimed that our hero would not be able to change his fate, but going through exile and survival with broken limbs is difficult even for a modern person. Moon sincerely felt sorry for his relatives, who were willing to give up anything for him, which is why he decided that if he was forbidden to change his own destiny, he would at least try to change the destiny of others. The incident at the banquet was not the cause of the family's downfall. Leopold had serious military power, but he was accused of treason, so it must have been a power struggle. If Moon could save his family, they would save him after his exile. Now his goal was to find the culprit or accuse someone else. The ceremony was in a day, and there was no time to negotiate. They would have to improvise. At this stage, the most important problem was the insult to the ruling family and Celia, the future empress. A common drug would certainly not work on a genius mage who appears once in 1,000 years. This guy had no memory of such substances in the mansion, so he had to go to one place. Moon decided to come up with an excuse to slip out into the city and check his guesses. The novel mentioned a place where all criminals and villains go. You can't avoid trouble just by talking. Meanwhile, lost in thought, the maid didn't notice the pensive Moon and bumped right into him, spilling the master and mistress's hot tea. Feeling guilty about the situation, Moon, like a true gentleman, apologized to the maid and asked if she was all right. He offered her his hand so she could get up, but the girl was so flustered when she saw the young gentleman that she couldn't believe her eyes. Surely many images of the possible outcome of her fate flashed through her mind, and out of fear, she quickly got up and began to wipe Moon's tuxedo. But nothing helped. She was so frightened that she flew into a hysterical fit and began begging Moon not to hit her, undress her, or throw her out onto the street. The girl's pleas deeply disappointed our hero, because it showed how bad an impression people had of Moon. That a drop of spilled tea caused such a reaction. Moon tried to be gentle enough to calm the poor girl down, because it really was a trifle, and, of course, he wasn't going to punish her for it. As soon as Moon touched her, he felt the intense heat in her body, and he couldn't understand why she wasn't resting in bed but working with such a high temperature. The girl, already calmed down in the arms of the young master, confessed that tomorrow there would be a banquet in honor of his ceremony, and there were not enough workers. Their pleasant conversation was interrupted by Anne, and Moon decided to seize the moment and ask her to change the schedule. As it turned out, this whimsical girl's name was Noel, and it was now very clear how much easier she felt. At least she was no longer shaking with fear of her master. Anne heard her master's request, but all the maids were busy, and if they let Noel go, the workload on the others would increase significantly. In that case, Moon ordered new workers to be found. After all, his family could afford it, and all sick workers should rest. Moon did not want a crowd of sick servants to cause problems for his guests. Anne, of course, obeyed the young master's will and did not dare to contradict him. After all, his decision was for their own good. His decision certainly surprised the girls, because he had always forbidden bringing in people from outside, considering them dirty. But what had changed today? Anne really did begin to notice radical changes in the young master, but she didn't even hint at this to her colleague, and simply said to carry out the order. One could only guess what was going on in this concubine's mind. She definitely had some plans for Moon, and to avoid any surprises, she was already thinking of planning something else. Meanwhile, the young gentleman returned to his chambers and quickly began rummaging through his chest, where he kept his important belongings. The thing was, the only way to deal with the princess was with a special psychedelic potion. Money was not a problem, but the potion was contraband. It was sold in only one place, and yet his predecessor was a real scumbag. Moon managed to find what he was looking for, even though it was very difficult to obtain, even for someone as high-ranking as him. A small black card with golden patterns served as a VIP pass to the black market, where many things unavailable to ordinary people could be obtained. It was nighttime outside, and Moon, having arrived with his entourage at the Chesford trading house, ordered them to wait for him at the entrance. He told them that he wanted to buy some jewelry for his parents for tomorrow's banquet. He himself darted behind a wall, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. For this purpose, he had prepared special clothing, and of course a mask to make it difficult to recognize him. In such places, people dressed only in this manner and no other. It was a kind of dress code. A guard was already standing at the door, and he had to ask everyone who wanted to enter through this door. Who goes there? There were special answers to these questions, which supposedly served as code phrases. The correct answer was, rat from the sewer. Why did the traveler come? He was looking for carrion, and at that moment he had to show his pass. After 2 such questions and a VIP pass, the esteemed guest could enter the guarded area. This place was the black market. A random passerby could not get in here, but if he did, he would probably think that some kind of masquerade was going on here. You could see anything here. Among the ingredients for potions, frog legs were probably the most harmless, because in other jars you could even see brains or other body parts. There were even synthetic animals for sale. This site was quite worthy of a fantasy world. There were even sellers of half-human slaves. And it was in this very place that the heroine would find one of her companions. But Moon was concerned with something else entirely. So he went into a more or less cozy shop, where, judging by all appearances, no one else had been today. It was a small shop, but it had everything. Moon was looking for a colorless and odorless potion against mages. Its properties were supposed to disable them for several hours. The shopkeeper was not surprised by the request because the rich loved interesting games. So she did not hesitate to recommend a good slave dealer who was inexpensive, and if he mentioned her name, he could even get a discount. Such merchants did not appeal to our hero. On the contrary, they repelled him. So he decided to refuse and leave. Before it was too late, the girl caught herself and said that she would find the desired potion, even though it was very rare. The merchant wore a mask on her face, and her body was completely covered. Even her voice was altered by magic, making it difficult to determine her gender, but her mannerisms clearly spoke for themselves. It was definitely a girl, she had an amazing body, and there was no doubt that the woman was beautiful. She hid her identity in order to survive in this place, where all kinds of people gathered and hunted. Moon believed that he could get help after his exile if they had a good relationship. The search for the right potion took time, so the merchant asked him to wait, but our hero was in no hurry if he got what he wanted in the end. At night, more and more customers began to arrive, and a painfully familiar face entered this dark place. Identity. The buyer was looking for a strong drug that would leave no magical traces. Such a request greatly confused the merchant, because usually no one buys such things. Moon also thought about it. Judging by the buyer's figure and faint scent, women also had situations where they needed such an item. Such drugs could only cause harm, but Moon saw no reason to dissuade the girl from her plan. Imagining that the victim would be the boy, he simply wished him luck in his mind. The potion had already been found, but our hero was confused by its bright color, which was too noticeable. But in reality, this potion would be impossible to detect in a drink. It was a minor drawback that was offset by its advantages. Even a few drops were enough to knock out an elephant for 2 or 3 hours. The possibilities of such a potion certainly appealed to Moon, even though he was reading a novel. But at that moment it was perceived differently. Everyone got what they paid for. The potion could even be tested on oneself. But the merchant charged an additional 5,000 IMs per hour for care, which Moon refused. The sleeping pill, Sun Nanyao, cost only 130,000, and no bargaining was allowed. Payment could be made in cash or by card. The girl didn't have that kind of money, and she wasn't going to pay with cash. She offered information in exchange for the potion. But 130,000 was a lot of money, and yet the buyer was sure that her information was worth that, and even more. The merchant decided to agree, but first she had to verify the information. After reading a few lines, the woman became genuinely interested in the information. But she still had doubts about whether it was true. In fact, the shop owner could have checked it himself. And such trust from a guest was impressive. The information was indeed worth more. The buyer could take her potion. Moon couldn't stop thinking about what was happening. But when it was his turn to pick up the potion, he decided to pay with his card. In addition to the main potion, the saleswoman gave him a small vial and asked him not to lose it. It was a small gift from her. She said that in combination with the red potion, the effect would be better. Moon thanked her for everything, but was in no hurry to leave. He was still interested in the information that the previous customer had sold. The merchant's eyes lit up, thinking that perhaps he would want to buy this information, which would mean additional profit. For some reason, she didn't want to name the price, but only pointed with her fingers. Moon thought she wanted 90,000 for it, but he was wrong. The price was much higher, as much as 900,000. Moon was not a poor man, but he knew the value of money and was not going to spend it thoughtlessly on everything. Obviously, the merchant wanted to increase her profit 7-fold when she made the deal right in front of him, which was suspicious. The black market was full of people looking to make a quick buck. If he paid too much, they might take advantage of him in the future instead of helping him. Moon was looking for a more decent partner. When the guests left the shop, the merchant could relax and even take off her mask, as well as think about the information she had received. She thought that tomorrow would be a simple ceremony for the pitiful young gentleman from the Campbell family. But who knew that a princess would appear at the banquet, and that strangers would be taken in due to a shortage of workers? Now she had to think about who she could sell this information to for the highest price. She began to recall that the second prince had always disliked his outstanding sister and Duke Raymond, who had quarreled with Duke Campbell. Why not sell this information to both sides at once? That way, she would kill 2 birds with 1 stone. The fateful night arrived, and the palace's riches rivaled Ali Baba's cave from 1001 Nights. The hosts of the celebration were dressed to the nines and delighted their guests with their smiles and hospitality. One of the guests came with the intention of introducing his third daughter to the Duke and his son. If she had met Leopold, why did she become completely flustered at the sight of Moon, and began to tremble like a little girl, either from excitement or fear? In order not to reveal her emotions, she simply ran away, pretending that her mother was calling her. Her father had to apologize for her behavior, because his daughter was very shy. But in any case, Moon did not take it to heart. He was actually embarrassed, because the current attitude towards him was the result of the actions of his predecessor. The girl was not shy at all. All the ladies here looked at him askance. And for good reason. Moon's reputation was terrible, and our hero had a lot of work to do to restore it. His father did not ignore his child no matter what. He was proud of him and noted that he was doing well, for which he was proud of such a son. Leopold admitted that he was worried, but in vain. Moon was the main character of this ceremony. After all, today the boy would become a man of the Campbell family. After his father's words, his uncertainty vanished, and a confident smile and clear gaze appeared on his snow-white face. One of the most important parts of the celebration was about to begin. Silence was required for this moment, for now everyone had to greet the third woman in line to the imperial throne. She was called the Child of Purity, blessed by the goddess of ice and snow herself, born amid the blizzards and silence of winter. Her Highness Princess Celia and Moon's bride. When Celia entered the hall, everyone held their breath, afraid of spoiling the moment. The most important guest had already arrived, and Moon's father had to meet 2 dukes, so he had to leave his son to take care of the princess on his own. Our hero decided not to waste any time, and immediately went to Celia to greet the precious lady. She was as charming as ever, which the groom was not afraid to point out. They had not seen each other for quite some time. The girl could hardly believe her ears when she heard even a single kind word from the young gentleman. Celia easily melted into a curtsy, as if to reinforce her words to Moon. To him, it sounded as if he were a rude man who did not know how to hold his tongue. Celia was a straightforward person and admitted that this was indeed the case, which embarrassed Moon a little. But in fact, the girl very rarely heard praise from him. The young man decided to end the pleasantries and invited the lady to relax a little before the official part of the banquet began. When Celia left, Moon breathed a sigh of relief. Although the girl was very beautiful, she seemed intimidating to him. For some reason, this heroine's aura really intimidated Moon. Celia also left Moon in deep thought, noting to herself that he was not himself. She was left wondering what had changed, or if it was just banal politeness. Moon heard the guests whispering that a certain illegitimate daughter was also there. High society remembered that this girl had had a duel with her fiancé. There were also rumors that Count Bugard had given her the position of heiress. This sparked huge controversy in society, because how could an illegitimate child, and a woman at that, claim the title? No one could understand Bugard, but no one dared to contradict him either, so everyone was afraid and just whispered quietly. In fact, in the novel, this girl was the main character, of the novel and of the whole world. Her name was Ariel Bugard. She probably heard various rumors about herself, but nothing could shake her confidence in herself and her abilities. Out of pure formality and politeness, Miss Bugard addressed the host of the evening, asking how he was doing. Moon was about to reply that everything was fine, but before he could finish, he heard screams. A man who had called Ariel a bastard stood up for her and was indignant at how she had dared to address the young gentleman. Moon's reaction was immediate. He immediately shut the man's mouth so that he would not dare to say such words to the girl. While he was calming the man down, Moon smiled and replied to Lady Ariel Bugard, thanking her for her concern. The girl's reaction was ambiguous. She was on the verge of indignation and surprise because she could not understand what was happening. Usually, Moon greeted her as a pitiful, illegitimate daughter. But how could these pea-brained fools remember her full name? Ariel, of course, was looking for a catch. While she was thinking, Moon decided to pay attention to her companion, Leah. This surprised the girl, as she did not expect the young gentleman to know her, but our hero didn't even show it. Of course, he knew her, and how could he possibly forget the names of important guests at the banquet? He wanted to greet Leah Angel properly, but finding Moon very suspicious, Ariel did not even allow him to touch her. Ariel's gaze was more serious than ever, and it was better not to interrupt her at that moment. She made it clear that she had come to the banquet only because of Moon's father, and that she didn't give a damn about what Moon had prepared for her. But if he started hitting on Leah, Ariel would not forgive him. The girl was decisive in her actions, unlike Leah, who cast an uncertain glance at Moon when Ariel pulled her away from him. Ah, what deep prejudices had taken hold of her body, that the brief encounter had not even decided anything. In any case, tonight would forever divide their fates into two parallel lines that would never intersect again. Ariel, as expected, would become the savior, and Moon would be able to focus on his own life. The official part of the banquet began, where our hero was accompanied by his parents. The young man gave a speech in which he announced that he had completed the coming-of-age ceremony, with a speech before all the nobles of the empire. He was recognized as the official heir to the family, but this title would only last one night if the plot remained the same. Speaking in public was not an easy task, and Moon breathed a sigh of relief when that part was finally over. Well, now it was time to move on to the most important part of the matter. Namely, Moon had to deal with Princess Celia. There was no time to waste. Everything had to be done on time. He quickly found her standing far away from the crowd. She was sipping red wine and looking at the moon. Moon Campbell approached Celia, pretending to feel guilty that he, as the host of the evening, had behaved so rudely and left the princess alone. He was so kind and asked the princess to do him the honor of dancing with him. To realize the seriousness of this invitation, the girl had to ask again if he had really invited her. She thought about saying something else, but changed her mind abruptly, because today was his ceremony, and she had no reason to refuse. The main couple began to move closer to the center of the hall, and of course, they did not go unnoticed. What was happening surprised everyone. It seemed that nothing like this had ever happened before. And so, to the classical music of the violin and piano, the couples merged into a dance. Moon danced quite well and led his partner beautifully, for which she complimented him. Although, as he said, he was only learning. Celia could no longer hide her bewilderment. She openly admitted that something had changed in the man, to which Moon reacted with apparent incomprehension, saying, "Am I really behaving inappropriately?" But the girl meant something completely different, and recalled the student ball when Moon tried to ask the Viscount's daughter to dance. At that time he said to her, "Rejoice and be glad, woman. I grant you the right to dance with me." Such behavior was indeed unworthy, and Moon did not even know how to respond. He felt very uncomfortable. It was no surprise that the princess remembered that moment. She probably expected Moon to do something like that. Hiding all his embarrassment and shame behind a mask, Moon admitted that he had made a mistake and asked the princess to forget about it. Continuing to dance, Moon decided to get down to business and invited the girl to his room after the dance. Celia reminded him that they were engaged, but Moon promised not to cross any boundaries, because it was the engagement he wanted to discuss. The princess was surprised by this turn of events, as she had not even imagined that her supposed fiancé would want to discuss such a thing. Moon understood that the princess did not like him, because it was a political marriage that His Majesty had demanded in order to maintain relations with Moon's father. They were simply obeying the will of the ruler. Therefore, if the princess proposed to break off the engagement, it would damage not only the reputation of the ruling family, but also their relationship. Moon found common ground because their thoughts on canceling the engagement coincided. Therefore, he believed that together they might be able to find a dignified way to break it off. As if resigned to this, Celia agreed with Moon, because such things really needed to be discussed together. And our hero was already rejoicing in his first small victory, because the princess had taken the bait. He planned to go to her room when the dance was over, but it seemed that the girl was already eager to get down to business. Celia didn't care about the rules. She took Moon by the hand and dragged him out of the hall, attracting attention to them. Even the servants were surprised that the princess had left with this silly young gentleman. But these weren't just servants. They were up to something and were going to get involved in this business. They had to act quickly because they were in the Lionheart's territory. Moon, already in the room with the princess, offered her some red wine, but she refused. For some reason, she couldn't drink a drop of alcohol, which was clearly not to Moon's liking. Things weren't going very well, because no one in the novel explained how Moon managed to charm the princess. He had to think quickly about where to add the red potion. Then Celia said she would like to drink coffee, but our hero supposedly only had black tea. Of course, it sounded strange, but he explained it as simply a problem with some drinks. So there was only red wine and black tea. In that case, out of politeness and etiquette, the girl had to agree to black tea. And of course, she couldn't ignore the fact that Moon was so happy to be brewing tea. Meanwhile, Moon busied himself with the tea. He remembered that one drop was enough for an elephant, but against such a powerful sorceress, a couple of extra drops wouldn't hurt. He had no idea what was in the second vial he had been given, so he decided it would be better not to add it, as it was too risky. Celia was impatient at that moment, so she peeked in on the young gentleman to check if everything was ready. Our hero tried not to arouse any suspicion, and the tea was almost ready, so he asked the princess to wait in the room. In this moment of carelessness, Moon accidentally poured the liquid from the unknown bottle, which was probably an aphrodisiac, into the tea. Moon was actually very frightened because if there had been magical traces in this potion, you would have caught him long ago. But what a disappointment it was when the young gentleman discovered all the potion spilled on the floor. After all, he had plans for it. He was going to dilute the potion into 10,000 portions and sell it as a sleeping pill to make some money to get him started. Celia couldn't wait for her fiancé and called out to him. But luckily he had already finished and was on his way to her. The princess looked closely at the Campbell family's black tea, trying to understand what was wrong with it. After all, it's not often you see black tea that is red and shiny. Moon had to think on his feet, so he came up with an answer on the spot, saying that it was a rare variety of tea from the East that their family had recently purchased. The tea was called Big Red Mantle, but that meant nothing to Celia. She was still suspicious and asked the gentleman to try it first. Moon reacted quite sharply to this request, saying how could he, a high-ranking gentleman, have mixed anything into it, although it was basic noble etiquette. Well, since the princess didn't trust him, Moon was forced to start drinking, but he didn't even manage to take a sip before Celia stopped him. It seemed to her that the young gentleman's tea was tastier than hers, so she offered to swap and quickly managed to take a sip. Moon was caught off guard and didn't even know what to say. The situation was going according to plan, which was even frightening. One sip was enough for Celia to feel heavy and want to sleep. All this happened in a matter of seconds, and the girl was so weak that she even dropped the tea on the floor. Moon was far-sighted and added the potion to both cups. The black market did not disappoint either. But the novel did not mention that the princess did not drink alcohol. Perhaps her predecessor had also mixed the potion into the tea. Or was it a coincidence? In any case, now was not the time for that. The main character was supposed to come for his head, and Moon needed to prepare urgently. He started with Celia's body, deciding to take off her tights and loosen her clothes a little. When he tried to undress her, he was still worried that she might get sick, so he decided it would be better to tousle her hair. When everything was ready with the princess, Moonu also had to get ready and take off his clothes. It was difficult, but he managed, even though the old classic clothes were not the most comfortable. When everything was ready, our hero had only to wait for the main character. Moon sat, waited, and glanced at the time. But something was wrong, because too much time had passed. Ariel was supposed to show up half an hour ago and save Celia, but she still wasn't there. But suddenly Moon realized that in the novel, everything was slightly different. Namely, Ariel's clothes had been stained by the sick maid, so the girl went to the bathroom to clean her outfit. But as she was walking, she noticed something strange in one of the rooms and caught Moon, who was about to attack the princess. Only the main component was missing, namely the sick maid. Moon, in his kindness, had sent Noel to the hospital himself. Now our hero had no idea what might happen. He had already changed the plot, and it was impossible to turn back time. Moon understood that he was in big trouble. But instead of panicking, he started to think. In any case, it seemed to him that the princess was still unconscious and he had every chance of finding a way to fix everything. Without even looking back, Moon felt a chilling cold, even though it was the middle of summer outside. He could no longer think calmly because the princess had long since regained consciousness and was not going to let Moon get away with it. With one swift movement, she knocked him to the floor and pinned him down, not giving him a chance to recover. Fearing what might happen next, Moon began to quickly justify himself to the princess, saying that it wasn't what she might think. Celia said nothing in response, only admitting that she was hot. It was obvious, her cheeks were completely red, her body wanted, But what or whom? Was it really the aphrodisiac? Moon was excited because he did not expect such a reaction. He thought that something had happened to the princess, so he decided to call the doctor immediately. But Celia didn't even give him a chance to get up, only pressing him harder to the floor. Moon was cold, which attracted Celia even more. She could no longer resist and kissed her fiancé, who was praying for Ariel to come quickly and save either him or the princess. Meanwhile, in another part of the mansion, Ariel had indeed gotten dirty and now wanted to clean her outfit. However, it wasn't the maid who had stained her outfit, but little Leah, who had dropped a piece of cake. The hallway was empty, but Ariel heard some noises and stopped. Then she asked who was there, but it was difficult to detect anyone in the empty corridor. Then the maid, Anne, came out and asked the guest to leave because she was not allowed to go where she was headed, as it was a restricted area of the mansion. Ariel was insolent and had no intention of leaving immediately, but began to ask the maid what was in this restricted area. Of course, Anne could not share the mansion's secrets with guests, but she noticed that Ariel's clothes were dirty, so she offered her help. Anne used advanced cleaning methods, namely magic. This method surprised Ariel, and she admitted that the Duke had clearly earned his title, since even his servants used magic. Once the cleaning was finished, Anne decided to remind her that a limited amount of pachichi cake would be served at the banquet, so she recommended that the guest not miss it. The mere mention of pachichi cake caused the girl to burst into unbridled delight, as it was one of her favorite desserts. Of course, Ariel quickly said goodbye and thanked her for her help, rushing back to the hall so as not to miss her favorite sweet treat. Anne, in turn, was glad to have gotten rid of the annoying guest. But even so, Ariel thought the maid was somehow strange, and that she reeked of blood, and she also sensed that another person was hiding nearby. Even if that was the case, what did it matter to Ariel? If she wasn't going to cause trouble for the owner of the mansion, then it was none of her business. Princess Celia was already an adult, a genius of magic, and clearly not a match for that stupid playboy. Of course, the cake was much more important than all these palace intrigues, one of the maids whispered to someone nearby. Ariel turned out to be the target of the 9th, but the 9th failed the task. A certain girl killed him, even though he was 2 levels above her, which surprised her companion. Her colleague was waiting for the girl to finish. It was difficult for her to break through this huge thing that covered the entire mansion without attracting attention. After all, it was installed by Leopold Campbell himself. Nevertheless, they had to hurry because Moon or the princess could appear at any moment, and then their mission would be failed. The girl understood this. But still, she hoped there was time, because when they were checking the outer wall, the couple was doing it. Meanwhile, Moon lay exhausted and scratched on the floor, hoping that the torture was over. He was doing his best to maintain his status as a 30-year-old great mage. They would have definitely finished him off on the spot if he had crossed the line with the princess. But unfortunately, it didn't change anything. Now Princess Celia was ready to hear Moon Campbell's last words before his death. Even in such a situation, he did not lose his optimism and continued to joke, hoping that if he remained silent, they would not kill him. Only Celia was adamant that since there were no last words, it would be better to end it quickly. Moon understood that he would not live to see the gallows if he could not calm the princess. Whether he would have a second chance at rebirth was also unknown. All that remained was to use the wisdom of a modern man and take a risk. Moon began to use his oratory skills, talking about how he had not appreciated the sincere love that had once blossomed in him, and how he regretted it when he lost it. Oh, if only heaven would give him another chance. It was difficult to tempt the Ice Princess with such words, and yet she did not kill him. But she simply did not understand why he behaved so disgustingly. They hadn't gone too far, and it was part of his sincere feelings, so he didn't consider it disgusting. But Celia was simply stunned by Moon's words, because how could he consider dirty and vile deeds to be sincerity? If he really loved her, he should have won her over with his character, strength, and honesty like a real man. Then she would have become his wife even without love, under a marriage contract. But he chose the most despicable and shameless way, drugging her. Moon understood the seriousness of the situation, so he began to apologize and said that he had no choice and that he did not intend to harm her. He needed results. But someone suddenly knocked on the door, and Celia ordered Moon to tell everyone to leave. But there was no need for that because the room was soundproof. The princess didn't react. She was still angry, but not as much as a few minutes ago. In the end, she let Moon go, allowing him to live a little longer. Now he had to get dressed and open the door. He tried to stall for time to think some more. Now he had huge problems and 3 possible outcomes. He could die at the hands of Celia, await public execution by order of the angry emperor, or allow someone to cut him to pieces in the dungeon, as in his dream. Moon went to open the door, knowing that he was about to meet the main character. But what good would she be now? But what a surprise he got when he saw someone other than the person he was expecting. A maid appeared with snacks, supposedly sent by her mistress, who had noticed that they had been talking for a long time with the princess. He didn't pay much attention to this and asked her to leave the snacks on the table. But then he stopped the girl, thinking that he did not remember her and had never seen her before. The maid claimed that she had been assigned to this position at night, so they could not have met. But to Moon, it still seemed suspicious. Anne had previously told him that they didn't have any extra uniforms, so they only hired simple servants. In fact, the girl was only pretending to be a maid. She was a murderer. She didn't try to kill him, which meant her goal was completely different. Celia was the one this girl was hunting. She literally burst into the room, finding the princess sitting on the sofa. At that moment, Moon must have felt helpless, because he had no special combat skills and didn't know how he could protect Celia. In any case, the princess herself possessed such skills perfectly, so it was difficult to catch her off guard. She immediately grabbed her sword and fought back against the enemy. It was not difficult for her to guess that this assassin had most likely been sent to her by her foolish brother. But information about clients was a closely guarded secret. Those who were to die did not need to know this. The third princess of the empire was to be killed in Duke Campbell's mansion. But killing the princess was no easy task, as she was not a defenseless girl, but a princess with enormous magical potential and power. Only the mercenary was too arrogant to realize this, believing that even the teachers at St. Mary's School could perform such attacks. But that wasn't the end of it. The princess's ice could take any form, and this time it turned into a spear called the highest power. The mercenary could only defend herself against this power, and her goal was not easy to achieve. Meanwhile, Moon was thinking that he needed to get out of there. After all, while the gods were fighting, mortals could only suffer, and he might not even notice his own demise. As soon as he approached the exit, he realized that everything was locked, and the fight continued to escalate, with Moon only able to hide from random blows in his direction like a mouse. In fact, there was no such assassination attempt in the original, and certainly not in the Duke's mansion. A terrible realization washed over him in a cold sweat as he remembered his actions. He himself had ordered the sick servants to be replaced with new ones, and everything that was happening was a consequence of his decision. They started looking for servants last night, which meant that someone was watching the mansion around the clock. The situation seemed hopeless, and Moon had no idea how he could get out of it with dignity. Now he could only pray for Celia's victory. Unfortunately, his weak body would not help him in a battle of this level. And yet she had become the assassin's sole target. The original would be irrevocably changed, and no one knew what would happen in the future. But the main question was whether Celia's victory would be a good outcome in this story. And yet, if she died unexpectedly, it would be impossible to explain what had happened. Nervously and with a sense of hopelessness, Moon Campbell continued to watch the fight, where you were hiding behind a broken door. Celia couldn't sense the magical fluctuations of the last two spells, and her body was weighed down by the magic of gravity, so she believed it was the work of the assassin in the next room. The rumors were true. The princess could recognize any magic at a glance. The mercenary had killed magic geniuses before, but even among them, Celia was considered a monster. The rumors were even an understatement, as the assassin believed. Celia offered her a deal. She was willing to spare the mercenary if she revealed who had hired her. In response, she just laughed, because assassins usually didn't get involved in such conversations, unless they were just stalling for time. Her colleague was blocking the room, but she asked to hurry up, because her strength was running out and she couldn't hold out for long. The mercenary began to recite the spell. I sacrifice the blood of hundreds of children's hearts to the god of the melting world, the lord of the red sun, and the great king of decay. Celia realized that the assassin was now performing the ritual of the evil god. The essence of the ritual was that the god would grant her power that could suppress the wind and snow. The power that the mercenary summoned pushed the princess away, but she remained conscious. At the same time, she was very angry, because how dare those evil priests show themselves to her? To her, they were no better than rats. But the mercenary was not offended by this comparison. In fact, she found it amusing. After all, she understood perfectly well that the balance of power between them had shifted after the ritual. And now the princess could die at the hands of these rats. The girl's eyes were completely merciless, and perhaps even filled with pleasure. For her, it was a job and a way to earn money. But sometimes she thought she could decide people's fates. Be that as it may, Celia did not give up easily. She fought to the last, fending off deadly attacks. The mercenary had no idea that the princess was also skilled with a sword. Nevertheless, between conversations, she continued to strike her, confident that the ice magic had already lost its power. And now Princess Celia had become an easy target for the spell. The girl was indeed in a terrible state, beaten, bleeding, exhausted, and barely able to stand, as if she had already accepted her fate. Seeing the princess weak and completely lost, the mercenary began to rejoice even more at the fruits of her labor. After all, she had finally managed to get to the head of the ice princess. The assassin aimed her blade straight at Celia's neck, but she didn't hit the neck at all, nor did she hit Celia. Before Celia's eyes were broad male shoulders and that golden hair. Moon Campbell decided to protect his bride at the cost of his own life, and took the blow himself, astonishing everyone. Everyone had one question: why? Even Moon himself wondered why. The killers only wanted Princess Celia. The young gentleman could have easily walked away. The exit was right in front of him. He could have simply ignored Celia's death and survived, but he couldn't. He couldn't watch his fiancée being killed in front of him while he sat in the corner like a pathetic coward. Surely he did not regret his choice, because he acted like a man, as he should have. But what was Celia waiting for? She should have run while she still could. The mercenary was very angry because she had killed the wrong person, and her job was already ruined. She was bewildered with anger. How did that lousy boy dare to interfere? But while her emotions were getting the better of her, Celia pulled herself together and moved towards her killer. With a sharp movement, she slit the girl's throat. Death was instantaneous, and the whole room was covered in blood. Moon's sacrifice had not been in vain. Finally, the mercenary was finished. Celia had lost a lot of strength, but she managed to pull through the final battle. Moon was still conscious, but he was bleeding to death. And these were probably his last moments in which he could look at his bride. Unfortunately, the mercenary from the next room had escaped. Celia suspected that Moon might have hired her too, but seeing him in front of her, she no longer thought so. Still, she didn't understand why he had saved her. No one would have known about his actions if Celia had died here. It was the perfect solution, wasn't it? Moon couldn't disagree with that, but now it didn't matter to him. Celia had once mentioned that Moon should have conquered her honestly and openly, like a man, and it was a manly thing to do. He was happy to save the life of such a beautiful woman. It was a worthy death. In 10 breaths, Moon would bleed to death, which would be enough time to say the last 3 sentences Celia was ready to convey to his mom and dad. Moon believed that such a troubled child would be better off disappearing without a trace so as not to upset them even more. And these became his last words. Before leaving for good, he asked Celia for forgiveness and gently stroked her snow-white face. He confessed that he truly loved her. But did he really think that his death would be enough for forgiveness? The princess's blue eyes began to glisten with tears. She hadn't shed a single tear during all this time. But Moon's death shook her. She did not accept his apology. Celia bent over Moon's body and began to use healing magic to prevent his death. He had to live and pay for his sins. Meanwhile, our hero already thought he was in the afterlife, because the fatigue, pain, and dizziness had disappeared, and it was so comfortable and warm. Moon still thought that everything had ended in death, and yet it was his choice. He behaved like a true hero, even in front of such a beauty. Moon had lost nothing and had even won. Moon may have won, but our hero lost the opportunity to live, judging by the outcome. But still, he didn't want to be a scoundrel who used others and didn't save them from trouble. It was difficult for him to be without a heartfelt animal like the master of the body. Suddenly, the book appeared before him, which he had seen once before, and considered to be cheats that could help him. But this time, the book was not empty. The book indicated progress toward his character traits, and on the next page was written, "Continue to fight for the world, Moon Campbell." This made our hero angry. After all, the book did not appear even on the threshold of death, and now it wanted to drag him back into that terrible dungeon. What was the point of a tiger that couldn't show its strength? Meanwhile, in the sewers of the Campbell mansion, the surviving killer ran away thinking that she should have killed Moon, because they had almost succeeded. A menacing male voice echoed through the sewers, stopping the killer. He clearly hadn't misheard, and someone really did want to harm his precious son. Leopold Ron Campbell got ahead of the enemy, which she didn't expect, and instinctively grabbed her swords. The Duke did not think that the girl knew his humble name. He did not remember her on the guest list, so why did she come without an invitation? In any case, Ron Campbell had heard everything the mercenary had been thinking, and now she would have to explain her remarks about his son. This was probably her last confession. Leopold would not forgive such a thing. Anyone who could harm his family would end up dead. Some time later, Moon was lying in his bed, under the supervision of a maid. He was in serious condition, but thanks to the efforts of his fiancée, he survived. He began to open his eyes, but when the maid spoke to him, he did not recognize her voice. Only when he opened his eyes completely did he remember his maid, Anne. She was sitting next to him, ready to call the doctor at any moment if her master felt unwell. Moon lay in bed for a long time, and of course, since he had been wounded, he had not gone to the toilet. But he couldn't get up. He already felt it when he tried to get up. At this stage, his body was uncontrollable and very weak, and without help, it would be difficult for Moon. He fell out of bed, but Anne managed to catch him. Moon didn't even have to go anywhere because there was a potty in his room. It seemed convenient, but it still embarrassed the man. Celia didn't want to shift the care of her fiancé onto others, but Anne still agreed to give him medicine, wipe his body, and take care of the toilet. This upset Moona. Anne had been helping him for several days now. Moona was unconscious, constantly tossing and turning. But he didn't need to worry. He hadn't wet the bed. The gentleman was very weak, so Anne did not hesitate to offer her help and remove his pants to make it easier for him to use the toilet. The young master was embarrassed. After all, he had already regained consciousness and did not want to ask for help with this problem. Nevertheless, he asked Anne to help him get to the toilet. She easily picked him up, noting that it would be faster that way. Surely our hero never imagined that girls would carry him in their arms, in the literal sense of the word. When Anne carried him down the hallway, he was very embarrassed because others saw him in that state. Nevertheless, everyone was very happy that the young gentleman had regained consciousness, and they were going to report this news to the lady. Finally, in the bathroom, Anne accompanied the young master there, as she had orders to protect him around the clock. But Moon was persistent and ordered her to leave, as he could take off his pants himself. And they managed to get to the room. Moon Campbell slowly came to his senses. He had been lying unconscious in his bed for 3 full days. As for the wound itself, Her Highness Celia took care of everything. She called the chief physician of the magical corps to examine him personally. The healing took place that same evening, but his brain suffered from oxygen deprivation due to blood loss, which is why our hero slept for so long. Celia herself said nothing on the subject, probably not wanting to dwell on it, but they communicated with the Emperor. The assassin's target was indeed only Celia, and the instigator was the underground black market, which had long been operating in Belrand. The Emperor was furious, so he sent troops there, and many people were arrested and killed. The Duke caught and extracted a confession from the 2 assassins, but the ducal house was still partly to blame for what had happened. Therefore, the Lord was preparing to receive punishment, but when he returned the next day from the investigation, it became known that the Campbell family had been spared. Probably, Princess Celia's intervention helped. While Moon was listening to all this, his heart nearly stopped, and did not fully understand why the gentleman was so nervous. Could it be that he had been involved with the princess in something that should not be discussed? Of course, he would not share the details with his maid, but he still remembered what had happened. And he admitted to himself that he was bad, but not stupid. He knew perfectly well that anyone who touched the princess would lose their head. Anne did not comment on what was happening, but Moon somehow felt pressure. In any case, it was time to take the medicine, which had long since cooled down. The young gentleman obediently drank a spoonful of medicine, but then he immediately spit it out. It was so bitter that it numbed his tongue. It was a tonic that helped restore blood, and knew that the young gentleman did not like bitter things, so she added sugar. But on the other hand, it was not a matter of obedience. Moon's body automatically rejected this nasty stuff. Meanwhile, there was whispering behind the door. The maids heard that the master was angry again, and they were afraid when he was in a rage. The girls remembered that Moon could whip people if they gave him something bitter. Would Anne be the next victim? Even though Noel had told them that he had become kinder, the girls were still afraid. Moon heard everything, so he ordered the maids to stay where they were, and not to tell his mother about it. It was just a regular medicine, and he was ready to drink it easily. Our hero is a man of his word. If he said he would do something, he did it. He gulped down the damn medicine in one gulp. The maids were frightened by the master's attention, so they quickly closed the door and began to leave. Moon didn't swallow the medicine, but kept it in his cheeks. Then he couldn't stand it anymore and spat it all out on the floor. This medicine was impossible to drink all at once. It caused vomiting, so Anne gave it in small portions, which she forgot to specify. Time passed, and our hero could not escape the torture of the medicine. He had already reached his 4th dose. The court physician said that Moon would be able to fully recover if he drank it 2 more times. But this medicine seemed more bitter than Moon's life. He just couldn't drink it anymore. It was too early for dinner, but if Moon felt hungry, Anne could offer him black tea and pachichi cake. But if he wanted something else, Noel would be outside. Anne had been trying so hard for him in recent days that Moon decided to talk to his mother about raising Anne's salary. The Duke and Duchess were surely worried about their son, so the maid left to tell them everything. In addition, Anne remembered something, because the master had received a letter from the palace in the morning, which Anne had put in the locker, and the pachichi was very tasty after all. It was no wonder that it was so hard to get. Before Anne left, Moon wanted to ask her one question. He could have eaten 10 pieces of pachichi instinctively. But how did she make him drink that bitter, nasty stuff when he was unconscious? Moon was just curious, because there were hardly any feeding tubes here. Anne knew perfectly well that her master couldn't stand bitterness, so she simply put a little sugar in his mouth. Finishing her explanation, she quickly left the room, leaving Moon alone with his thoughts. Only then did he begin to wonder, how could that have been possible? And whose mouth did she put that sugar in? Could she have transferred the medicine from her mouth to his? Anne knew exactly when she needed to leave so as not to accidentally encounter the master's anger. And all the previous Moon was a fool. He had a cool father, a beautiful mother, and he himself was handsome. Such a girl loved him. Why wasn't he satisfied with the life of a rich young master? And why did he quarrel with Ariel? Moon remembered that Anne had given him medicine from her mouth to his. It seemed like it was his first kiss. Or was it? His first kiss had been before that, with his fiancée. Speaking of his fiancée, he had received a letter from her, which he was so eager to read that he jumped out of bed. Moon felt excited as he opened the envelope, because Celia's decisions or any words she wrote could influence certain events in Moon's life, and he still loved her. Celia wrote in the letter, "Okay, we'll consider you a real man, Moon Campbell." After reading these lines, Moon breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed that the investigation into his crimes was being postponed, and yet our hero managed to avoid the worst outcome. Evening came, and it was time for dinner with his parents. They were very worried about their son. His mother was scared to death, and his father had to carry his son's bloodied body out. If anything else happened to Moon, his parents would find it very difficult to cope. Moon tried to calm his mother down so she wouldn't cry, but she couldn't look at her son and hold back her tears. Moon had been so perfect, and now his chest was marred by such an ugly scar. His father tried to lighten the mood, saying that scars only made a man more handsome. Besides, their son had risked his life to save the princess. In the worst-case scenario, no matter how many heroic deeds Leopold had performed, he would not have been able to withstand His Majesty's wrath. As it later became known, 3 assassins were involved in the attempt. One broke through the barrier, and the second was killed by the princess. The third was responsible for cover and hid in the sewers of their mansion. The father sent the 2 survivors to the palace that same night. The mercenaries kept their mouths shut, and it was difficult to get any information out of them. But there was enough evidence. They were bounty hunters who had been working on the black market in Belren for a long time. They worshipped an evil god named the King of Decay. As expected, the novel gave a limited picture. Our hero could not remember such a group in the plot. Perhaps it was insignificant or secret. Later, the Imperial Guard reported that this group had existed for many years and did not shy away from any tasks. They were ready to kill even their own parents if the price for their heads was high enough. But now there was no need to worry. Duke Leopold had already gathered his men and completely destroyed this vile organization in 2 days. Leopold was modest, but his wife spoke of him with admiration, for he was the first Grand Duke since the founding of the country to receive the title for outstanding military service. The vile murderers had harmed his son, and he could not let them go. Moon, of course, had no doubts about his father, but unfortunately, it was never possible to find out who had hired these murderers. As soon as the mercenaries mentioned the name of the person who hired them, they were burned alive. That is why His Majesty was so angry. The black market in Belrand was destroyed. But they could only understand that the client controlled the underground forces of the capital at a deep level. Therefore, His Majesty ordered a thorough investigation of all the nobles. The most likely suspects would be one of the princes, several dukes, and marquises. Moon began to remember that there was a similar event in the novel when his father destroyed the black market in Belrand. But the reason was in order to kill His Majesty's beloved concubine, which was successfully carried out. In his anger, he sent the nightly order to clean up all the underground forces of Belrand. The brutal purge lasted 3 months. So many people died that the sewers were stained crimson. This event was dubbed the Slaughter on the Bloody River. Only it was supposed to happen 2 years later. But now the black market has disappeared, which means the concubine will not die, and there will be no bloody river. This incident became a turning point in the middle of the plot. Ariel, who was participating in the auction at the time, was drawn into the struggle between the knights and the criminal world. She found herself in dangerous situations several times, but her status as the main character protected her from death, and her power grew rapidly. In other words, the Bloody River event was a transitional step from the Academy arc to the World Salvation arc. But now, the 2 days off that Moon gave Noel triggered an unprecedented chain reaction. Everything became very confusing, and now it was impossible to return to the original plot. His parents and those around him asked our hero to rest, but he couldn't relax. The plot had completely deviated from the original, which meant that the future was becoming unclear. Moon's knowledge was no longer as valuable. Survival depended solely on his efforts. Therefore, he needed to think carefully and make a list of initial goals. The first goal, of course, was to survive. The second was to avoid ending up tortured in a dungeon. The third was to become stronger, and the fourth was not to trust the Black Book. Moon was deep in thought, trying to remember every little detail and moment from the past. He remembered the maniac's voice. It seemed unfamiliar to him, but he couldn't rule out the possibility that someone close to him could have captured him, locked him in that prison, and torn him to pieces. He had to be more careful with the prophecies of the Black Book. He still didn't know what conditions would lead him to that ending. If it wasn't Ariel or Celia, who could hate him so much? There was too little information, and he couldn't draw any conclusions from a few fragments of that dream. No matter how much he thought about it, the future still seemed too uncertain. Moon decided not to think about it now and to focus instead on what he could achieve in the present moment. And for now, personal strength became his priority. The Duke's son had enough ways to become stronger, but they were too primitive to compensate for the gap with the main characters. The owner of the body wasted too much time. He spent a whole year at the Santa Maria Academy of Magic, but the only spell he learned was a simple light spell. Well, at least his physical form was not bad. The Duke's son should reach the upper threshold of the first level. The Academy taught 3 systems: warriors, mages, and priests. The strength of each was divided into 5 levels, and the high ones were not available to our hero now. Even if he made every effort to reach the 5th level, it would be useless, because Ariel and Celia were chosen by the gods. In this world, the chosen ones rose above the main systems. They were cheaters who could soar higher than the heavens. The goddess of ice and snow bestowed her power on Celia at birth, and she had been able to control ice since childhood. Her abilities were an innate instinct. Priests who could obtain divine power through prayer and offerings were nowhere near her level. And then there was the super cheater Ariel. In the later stages of the book, she had double-digit gods on her side. Various deities are associated with her. She can call on them for help at any moment if she can't handle it herself. She is the Monkey King in female form. Even if we talk about the current Ariel, who is not physically stronger than Moon, she possesses magic, divine gifts, and rare items. She is capable of defeating a simple warrior or mage who is 2 levels above her. As for Moon, there is no question of that. She has absolutely no chance. Therefore, the first goal is to develop strength that will allow him to defend himself against Ariel in the first stage. Moon's cheats certainly could not compare to the cheats of the main character. But during the assassination attempt, that thing awakened new abilities in him. So he decided to check something and summoned the Black Book. It appeared at the first call, but our hero didn't have time to rejoice. He felt a terrible pain between his legs. After that, he couldn't sit normally. Moon was angry at the book. Did it really want to kill him? Why didn't it just say so right away? Why did it decide to attack Little Moon? He could still be useful. No matter how angry he was, the book had its own plans. It began to flip through its pages, as if it wanted to show our hero something. One of the pages described all the recent events and actions that Moon had taken. There were even details about how Celia knocked him to the floor. Moon sat and read it as if he were reading some kind of erotic book with himself in the lead role. He read it from cover to cover, but something in particular caught his attention. Among all the words that were written in blue, there was one word written in red, and that word was killer. Just like last time, a dark and red haze began to engulf Moon, and everything repeated itself. It wasn't the most pleasant process, and Moon thought it would be nice if he had at least been warned about it in advance. He found himself in some unknown place, surrounded by gray walls and a tall, round building inside which he was located. Last time he was in some kind of dungeon, but now it was a completely different place. Could it be some kind of space inside the book itself? A dark shadow appeared out of thin air. which our hero could feel with his skin. The hall was so deserted and quiet that even this shadow's footsteps were audible, which frightened Moon. Everything happened so quickly that Moon didn't even have time to move. The killer who had wounded him a few days ago cut his throat again. He was aware of all this, but he was paralyzed by fear and incomprehension of the situation. When his throat was cut, he could still see the killer, as if she were real. Then he woke up as if from a terrible dream. Moon tried to understand where reality ended, and the vision began. It all happened in a matter of seconds. He had just arrived in an unknown place, where he was immediately killed. But where did the killer come from in the book? The black book began to turn its pages again, which Moon noticed. On the page, he could see his skill level in various areas. His warrior and mage skills were at level 1. His priest skills were absent. His dagger skills had reached 1% of level 1, and his shadow step skills had reached 0.5%. Finally, our hero realized the true power of the black book. He even apologized for yelling so loudly at his treasure. His excitement was awakened, and he wanted to try it a few more times. And if his guesses were correct, then this cheat could turn out to be amazing. It was late at night outside, but not everyone in the castle was asleep. Moon Campbell continued to test the black book and train his abilities with it. The passage of time inside the book and in reality was the same. This time, he managed to hold out for 3 seconds. Now he could check his skill level. It was important for him to record everything so he could understand how he was progressing. The warrior and mage skills were at level 1, while the priest skill was absent. Dagger mastery and shadow step improved by 0.5%. The black book really did record the skills of opponents. Now our hero would be able to hone his skills in battle against shadows in the illusory world. And that meant he would be able to learn skills for free that I had only seen once. In reality, he couldn't remember the mercenary's nimble steps, but the book recorded everything. Moon could fearlessly observe and learn every slightest movement. The only question was how much time he was willing to devote to it. With such a powerful cheat, even the main character was nothing to fear. He only had to ask for the power, and it appeared. It seemed that this time, the young master would not die. Although he still didn't know what the rapid growth in skill was connected to, he decided to just practice. His opponent easily knocked Moon out, not even giving him a chance to fight back. But he did not give up. Immediately after being defeated, Moon returned to his previous position and struck her on the back of the head again and again and again. But his training was interrupted by the maid knocking on the door. It was time to take his medicine, which Anne had brought. Moon was wrapped in a blanket like a ball, shivering inside. Anne noticed that Moon had grown up, but he still slept like a child. The girl found this very cute and couldn't contain her affection. Anne understood that the young master was probably just asleep and decided not to disturb him, so she cast a heat-preserving spell on the medicine and left the room. A few seconds later, Moon emerged from under the blanket and greedily gulped air. Unfortunately for him, he had to endure the pain in his groin again, which he tried to control as best he could and not swear. He understood that the difference in strength between him and the mercenary was enormous. But she still managed to taunt him, completely shameless. Nevertheless, that only increased his motivation. Moon wanted to touch his opponent at least once. The night passed with 180 attempts to keep up with the killer, and he managed to stay there for 30 seconds. It could be said that Moon did not sleep at all that night. And in the morning, this had both good and bad consequences. Due to the impulse in his body, he accidentally took the medicine Anne had left on the nightstand. His condition was serious. He had only just recovered from a deep wound, and now he was physically exhausted and had not slept well. It was impossible to die in the illusion, but the pain he experienced all night was very real. He kept returning there to look for a loophole and avoid the fatal blow, but he never succeeded, and the pain of nearly 200 deaths almost finished him off. But he couldn't give up. Not now, when life was just starting to get better and clearer. Moon gathered his last strength and got up to check the results of his efforts. His skill remained at the same level, but his dagger mastery had reached 35%, and his shadow step had reached 11%. Moon was still far behind the assassin's level, but nevertheless progress had been made and would continue to be easier. Despite his fatigue and lack of sleep, he couldn't wait to try out his skills in real life. First, he decided to try shadow step. This tactic allowed him to move quickly and silently across surfaces, and what a surprise it was when he discovered that he had actually succeeded. It was definitely a success. In just one night, he managed to learn such an important combat skill, but there were consequences. His legs hurt a lot. Moon had no idea that this technique could damage his legs. It was very painful. But the assassin didn't even blink while fighting Princess Celia. Nevertheless, our hero realized that this skill could not be learned at the first level of warrior. The academy mentioned that combat techniques could only be used in combination with combat energy, and energy control was taught to second-level warriors. Moon was too weak and needed to adjust his plans, so he thought about finding a teacher. He also remembered that classes would soon begin at the Santa Maria Academy, but most of the teachers there were mages, and he didn't remember any strong warriors there. In this world, magic was so convenient that there were almost no people with knowledge of martial arts. Even a lot of money did not guarantee success in finding a teacher. But what if he remembered the most famous and powerful warrior from the original novel? A man who was considered the pinnacle of warriors, with the strength of 1,000 men. This man was right under his nose, in the same house as Moon, and all he had to do was ask. When it came to the strongest and most famous warrior of the century, only one person came to mind. For 15 years he served in the personal guard of His Majesty, who was still a prince at the time. At the age of 20, he led the guard to suppress the rebel forces and successfully stabilize the situation during the new emperor's ascension to the throne. At the age of 25, he became a marshal defending the border, and fought several battles that shook the continent. By that time, the country's territories had been clearly defined, but the empire forced neighboring countries and demons to retreat a considerable distance. There were no invasions for almost 20 years. At 32, he returned home triumphantly, and was awarded the title of Lionheart. He became the only duke since the founding of the empire to receive the title for military exploits. He never suffered a single defeat. He was a man who was ready to kill even a stray dog if it posed a threat to the empire. This man was Moon's father. The former owner of the body deserved a miserable end because he did not realize that he was sitting on a treasure. With such a father, our hero did not need academies or teachers. It was enough to simply ask him to take care of his education. His thoughts were interrupted by a woman's voice, and noticed that the young master was no longer asleep. As it turned out, his father was looking for Moon and wanted to talk to him about something. This was very convenient, because Moon wanted to discuss something with him. The girls wanted to ask him something, and as usual, addressed her as Little Sister Anne. But then they came to their senses, apologized, and called her the headmaid. It turned out that Anne had already been promoted to headmaid. The former headmaid had resigned, and they decided to appoint her as the new one shortly after Moon woke up. Moon felt guilty, because it was probably all because of his order. His father told him that the former maid had been with him since he was young. Formally they were master and servant, but in reality, their relationship was like family, and he was surely upset. Anne tried to reassure her master that in the end, it wasn't his fault. She had left her position, but not the Campbell family. As soon as her mother saw her son, she immediately took him in her arms, hugging him so tightly that there was no point in trying to break free. Moon had a habit of calling her mother, but she didn't like that at all, and constantly asked him to call her mom, or mommy. Mom suggested that he sit down and touch her belly. Moon still couldn't quite understand, or rather, he couldn't believe what his mother was saying, but it seemed to be true. Moon was going to have a little brother or sister. Lately, his mother had been feeling unwell, and the imperial physician examined her when he came to see Moon. It turned out to be true. Mom asked Moon whether he would prefer a little brother or a little sister. But he liked either option, just as his mother had expected. His father interrupted their pleasant conversation, because his older brother had barely recovered from serious injuries, and the new baby was also fragile, so they should worry less. His father asked Moon to sit down. He had something important to discuss with him. When Moon heard the big news, he was stunned and shocked, because his father was going back to the front. The Duke was already preparing to leave after lunch, considering that his son would begin his studies in a month, so he knew that his wife would remain alone in the capital. Therefore, his mother and most of the servants would also leave in the afternoon. Leopold would take her home to protect the child. He entrusted the care of Noyce to Faye, who happened to be the former headmaid. Moon really didn't want his parents to leave. He hoped there was at least some slim chance they could cancel the trip. After all, there were enough generals in the Empire ready to lead the army into battle. Why did the Duke have to do it? It was an emergency, and Leopold had no choice. The damned demons from the lands to the west had begun to stir after 10 years of silence. At best, his father would be away for 3 years. Only now did Moon begin to remember where this situation was mentioned in the original. The demon invasion was a diversionary tactic to mislead people. The main plan would be implemented 3 years later, and the main character would become the savior of the world. Moon's father would be gone for 3 years, if not more. What would happen to his plan, his teacher, his safety? Moon was going to become a recluse and shake up the world with his return after some time. But now it seems that everything is over. The carriage was already ready. His belongings were packed, and nothing could change the situation. All that remained was to look for a new plan. Noise tearfully saw her husband off, and he kindly asked her not to cry, as it could harm the baby. If it weren't for the new baby, she would not have returned home, and now she would have to wait for the holidays to see Moon. Moon could barely stand on his feet from everything that was happening and couldn't pull himself together, even when his father spoke to him. His father knew that his son was not without courage, for he had protected Her Highness with his life. He asked his son to remain a worthy member of their family. They were obliged to protect this country. Such was the responsibility of the 4 great ducal families of the empire. The medal on his chest was the coat of arms of their Campbell clan. The blade symbolized His Majesty's sword that pierced the evil dragon, all enemies of the empire. Moon's father was the sharpest blade in the country. Every member of the Campbell family would one day find themselves on their own battlefield. This was also true for Moon. He could continue his father's work or find his own path. None of that mattered. His father was just trying to say that his son already possessed the qualities of an adult man. His father had prepared the ground for his son, which he himself did not have, so Moon could do whatever he wanted with it. But everything his father said was a lyrical digression. Now his father wanted to know what his son thought of Anne. Moon replied that she was very nice. If he had to choose whether he liked her or not, it was more yes than no. Leopold had watched her since childhood. In his opinion, Anne was a smart girl from a decent family. Moon and Anne were not like master and servant. If Moon liked her, he had to hurry. The Campbell family had few descendants because Leopold and Noyce rarely saw each other. And now the Duke was going back to the front. Still, Moon was concerned that he was engaged to Celia. But that was just the Emperor's idea. He wanted to make the Campbell family his support and balance the forces behind the Crown Prince. If the wedding did take place, they would simply make the princess the main wife. But in 3 years, Leopold wanted to have grandchildren. And no buts. It was an order from the head of the house. Anne overheard the gentleman mention her name in conversation with Moon, so she asked if there were any tasks for her. Moon did not take the conversation seriously, but he still shared it with Anne. He told her that his father was just trying to bring them together so that the Campbell family would have new descendants, but he was sure that his father was just joking. Anne was currently a maid, but in the future she would have a new life and destiny. Moon was sure that such a wonderful worker and girl would easily find herself a good man instead of the disgusting young master. Anne should immediately inform Moon when she meets someone suitable. He would let her go and promised her a luxurious dowry. After all, the Campbell family could not lose face in front of her husband's family. Moon wanted Anne to find happiness, and their family would always be there to support her. The young gentleman left the girl with a smile on his face. He was happy that he had made such a speech, because it meant that 10 years of reading novels had not been in vain, and anyone would be moved to tears by such a speech. But the girl's reaction was not quite what the young gentleman had expected. Could the Campbell family really let her go? The young gentleman was very different from his former self. Anne decided not to wait any longer. She had to do everything that night. It was true that plans never kept up with changes. But Moon was still going to become stronger, even without his father's help. He decided to study on his own, so he went to the library. The Duke's family had made their fortune on the battlefield. This library could not be compared to the Imperial Library, but there were enough books on martial arts here. Moon decided that it would be better for him to take an academic leave of absence, so that he would not have to return to school and come into contact with the main character, which was risky for him. The young man decided to start by studying combat manuals and to continue fighting in the Black Book space, and he decided that he would not leave the house until he could defeat the Shadow. He had already read half of one book and the manual for another, so he wanted to check something now. It was enough to pick up the book and read the title for it to appear in the Black Book. It was an amazing feature. The Black Book contained all the necessary techniques and basic guides. Since he began to understand how to use the Black Book, Moon had been practically inseparable from it and regretted his words about its uselessness. While the young master was showing his love for his book, Anne came in. She brought him a midnight snack. But when she saw the young master kissing the book, she felt a little embarrassed. Moon greeted the maid with a grateful smile. He understood that his father had taken almost all the people away, and that 5 employees remained to take care of him and the huge mansion, for which he was grateful. Anne presented her master with a red collector's wine that Count Locke had sent them that morning. Only 100 bottles were produced each year, and it was now selling for an incredible price of 200,000 a meal. Anne hoped that Moon would want to try it, but he refused, saying he needed to get back to reading. The maid's plan failed. She was angry and in her rage, smashed the glass bottle, but did not show any emotion on her face. Moon wanted to drink coffee, but by some chance there was only wine and black tea. There was no choice, so he had to drink tea. Our hero thought about it, because the whole situation sounded very familiar. It turned out that due to the maid's negligence, rats had gnawed through the bag of coffee, and they would only buy new beans tomorrow, and surely the master would not want to drink something that rats had been crawling around in. Moon had no reason not to trust Anne, so he decided to drink her tea. But just like with Princess Celia, after one sip, he dropped the cup of poisoned tea on the floor. He began to lose consciousness and control of his body, and tried to catch the man's body so that it would not hit the floor, but Moon could not understand how she could betray him. In response, Anne said that she would never betray her master, and now he could sleep peacefully. Anne felt sad. She loved the young gentleman so much, and couldn't understand how he could say such a thing. Moon had changed, and Anne had noticed. She believed that only her love could purify him. So she asked him to accept her love, and they would be together until the end of the world. Moon found himself in the same place as before. Only now he knew who the person from the prophecy was, and it was Anne. The drug from the black market dealer was indeed very effective. Moon still did not understand what this woman wanted to do with him. Anne had joined the Campbell family 10 years ago, when Moon was only 8 years old. Since then, she had existed only for the young master, and belonged only to him. The reverse was also true. Moon also belonged to Anne. That is why she was determined to bring the bad master back to the right path. Moon was panicking. He had no idea what the girl was talking about and asked her to let him go so they could talk normally, but it was too late. Moon didn't need to do anything. He just had to leave everything to Anne. After all, after this night, everything would change and would never be the same again. Every scent, every hair, and every drop of blood would belong to Anne. Moon was in very bad shape, but he was glad that it was finally over. He lost count after the 10th time he lost consciousness. Our hero never thought that his 30-year career as the Great Virgin would end this way, and the girl who pushed the original owner of the body onto the path of a scoundrel and who wanted to chop him into pieces in the prophecy was a simple maid named Anne. It was difficult to call it love. Anne was dependent, but she couldn't admit it even to herself. Moon could have prepared himself for this mentally, but not physically. The young master tried to get up, but the girl did not allow it, gently pressing on his chest. She didn't even let him say a word, showing that she was now in charge. Such a faint pain flashed before a decade of waiting. Anne had protected, guided, and pampered the young gentleman all these years. She wanted to make him an arrogant, useless pretty boy whom everyone avoided and hated. She had worked hard for 10 years just for this day. That's why she wasn't going to let Moon go today. The most beautiful, gentle, and reliable maid in the family turned out to be a yandere and the instigator of the young master's downfall. Moon understood that this maid could kill him, so he was going to make his escape. It was too early for him to die. Anne watched everything her master did, which he didn't even notice when he tried to pick the locks. But he attributed his actions to the fact that his hand had simply gone numb, and he wanted to move it. It was already noon, and Anne couldn't do anything about it. She didn't want to leave the young master. But she had to take care of the mansion's affairs, otherwise someone might suspect something was wrong. Besides, she decided that if the young master already belonged to her, then the others could be removed. Moon was seriously worried. These words scared him a lot. He ordered the maid not to even think about it, but decided to play with the master. She was curious to know if he really liked another maid, or if he had his eye on Noel. He found such assumptions very strange and objected to her questions, but Anne was just joking. The young master shouldn't have been worried because she had no plans to do anything unnecessary while he was under her command. In that case, Moon asked her to remove his shackles. If she loved him, then she couldn't leave him in that position for the rest of his life. She didn't even have to persuade the girl. She agreed immediately. With a snap of her finger, all the shackles immediately opened and freed his body. Of course, she advised the young gentleman not to do anything foolish. The room was enclosed in high-quality steel. The lock was custom-made and had only one key, and spent a lot of time and effort to build a secret room right under her master's nose, and so that the workers would not be surprised by Mr. Moon's absence, and told everyone that he had become lonely after his parents left. So he returned to the academy early, which surprised no one. Of course, no one will ever know what they are doing here, and will continue to bring food 3 times a day, just as before. nothing has changed. She remains Moon's most loyal servant, but now Moon belongs to her. Moon deserved the title of An's master because he was so energetic. The girl wanted to continue where they left off, but it was time for her to go. In the meantime, the young master had to rest well while she was away. Moon was left alone in a closed room, without even his clothes. He thought through many options, but in none of them did he suspect An. Would he remain An's toy for the rest of his life? If they did this 10 times every night, Moon would die anyway. Right now, will was the most important thing to him. A person without freedom was no different from a fish in a can. He had to try every way out. So first, Moon tried to simply open and break down the door. That was unsuccessful, so he tried to push it open somehow. And all this did not end in success, but only in pain and new bruises. And really hadn't lied. There was high-quality, durable steel everywhere, even behind the stone walls. It seemed that even the black book wouldn't help him. He didn't summon the book, but it appeared. Moon understood perfectly well that simple magic would not destroy the steel that An had prepared. Moon believed that An was as chosen by the gods as Celia was. Therefore, a few intense training sessions with the shadow here could not help him. And yet he decided to train. So what if he died a couple of times? It was boring here anyway, and at least this was some kind of entertainment. As our hero began to flip through the pages, he remembered that he had read several books the night before. And that was the formula for victory. Maybe it wasn't over yet? Moon decided not to give up and to take control of the situation. He began to train, but not in the space of the book, but in reality. He chose to start with push-ups, doing 200 of them. In fact, he was lucky that his body was not out of shape. The space of the black book improved skills but harmed the brain. Physical strength could only be built up using such primitive methods. And yet our hero was unhappy about being used. Now Celia and An were pinning him to the floor and doing whatever they wanted with him. He should have been on top. While he was indignant, An returned, happy to see the young master full of energy. She had already finished her work and returned with food and a bath. In addition, she noted that Moon had said to her what wives usually said when greeting their husbands after a hard day's work. And she found it sweet. Moon hadn't bathed for 2 days, so the bath was very welcome. Moreover, the water in the bath was adjusted to the right temperature. Now our hero had a choice that An had given him. He could take a bath, or maybe he wanted to eat, or maybe he wanted An. Of course, the gentleman wanted to take a bath. He was too clean and didn't even care about food. Moon wanted to tell An something, but she interrupted him, worried that the temperature might be wrong or something else. But that wasn't the problem at all. The young gentleman wasn't a child and could wash himself, and noted to herself that only 1 night had passed, and she had already managed to displease the gentleman, to which Moon objected. Since the young master belonged to An, she felt she had to clean every inch of his body. An felt his arousal when she touched Moon below, but he didn't have to hold back if he wanted An. After all, she was always there for him, but it was just a natural reaction. Besides, Moon didn't want to lose to this yandere, and decided not to tease him anymore. Since the young master didn't need help washing, she asked permission to at least feed him. The dish was still hot and smelled simply delicious, so of course Moon did not refuse such a meal. The dish tasted as good as it smelled, and after he tried it, he couldn't help but smile. Moon had never eaten such delicious beef, even with his mom and dad. It wasn't just tender, it had no tough edges at all. In fact, the young gentleman had eaten it before, but she had prepared it as soup so as not to surprise Moon. The meat was indeed beef, but the question was, what part of the cow was in this dish? With a slight smile, An admitted that it was a bull's penis, that is, a sexual organ. After hearing this, Moon lost his appetite. But it wasn't just any bull's penis. It was that of a huge mogul. They were particularly strong in this area. There were even rumors that if a male did not find a mate during the mating season, many trees with hollows would appear around their habitat overnight. Therefore, they were also called sacred hollow bulls. But this did not impress our hero at all. There were dishes made from tiger, bull, golan, troll, and many other whips. Probably something excellent could be made from a dragon. But unfortunately, they were difficult to find in the Empire. Moon couldn't even listen to him talking about it, let alone eat it. But in reality, the maid saw nothing shameful or surprising in this, because she had been adding this ingredient to her young master's food for a long time. Moon could no longer contain his emotions. He was disgusted that the girl had locked him in a dungeon and now was feeding him something like this. And anyway, what kind of fool would eat a whip? He demanded to be released, but suddenly felt weak, and understood her master's indignation perfectly well, for losing one's freedom was very painful, but An could not allow the young master to disappear forever. So the young master found himself unconscious in the arms of his maid, once again completely at her mercy. The night was just beginning, and Moon felt simply disgusting after such torture. Fortunately for Anne, she had already finished and was about to leave. Yesterday, Anne had gone a little overboard, and her master was too tired. So today she decided to limit herself to 2 times. Anne noticed that Moon was feeling unwell, but he did not respond to her, merely grunting discontentedly and turning away. Of course, the young master was still angry, and of course, Anne would like him to be in a slightly different mood. So, since the master had behaved well, she had a suggestion, and could fulfill one small request of his. Moon immediately asked her to let him out, but she flatly refused. When he asked her to return his clothes, he was refused again. He asked for various things, but was refused everything, and in the end, this made him angry, because no matter what he asked for, she refused him. Anne decided to think for herself about what she could agree to, so she decided to give the gentleman the privilege of choosing his own lunch and dinner. Moon was upset, but it was better than nothing. So he thought about what he would like for breakfast. He closed his eyes and remembered that autumn was approaching. He indulged in his memories of sailing on Lake Beipo. Moon constantly admired the falling autumn leaves and sipped Count Locke's wine. At that time, he often had the opportunity to taste fresh autumn fish. Lake Beipo was far away, and Anne began to wonder how she could get fish from that lake, unless she could send someone there. Moon couldn't convey his sadness about those memories when he could frolic on the lake. And now all he could do was rot in this small prison until he died. The man literally burst into tears because if Anne couldn't even get him fish from there, then what was the point of living? It would be better to die. This scene certainly made an impression on Anne. She always tried to please her master, and it pained her to see her man sad. Therefore, after exhaling all her heaviness, she agreed to her master's request. Moon even shed a tear right in front of her to make sure she was really ready to take this risk. Anne was indeed ready to get fish for her master at any cost, which of course was to be expected from the most reliable maid of the Campbell family. These words literally melted the ice in the girl's heart, as if it were the highest praise for her. She couldn't contain her emotions and kissed the man passionately. Then she went to the door, proving her intention to deliver on her promise. The lake was really far away, but Anne promised to return in the afternoon tomorrow. Anne could barely control herself and caught herself almost breaking down. Moon had become too dear to her. She wanted to bring him the fish as soon as possible so that she would have more time to take care of him. Meanwhile, our hero was glad that this woman had finally left and that another night of torture had given him the opportunity to turn the situation around. Moon decided not to waste any time and immediately took out his black book. Now he wanted to try being in other spaces for simulation, which was within the power of the black book. Moon wanted to find himself in a space with 1,000 locks based on a book he had read earlier. His goal was to perfect his skill. Besides, he had to do all this before Anne returned. Meanwhile, Anne was on the shore of Lake Beipo. There was a thunderstorm, and Anne was forbidden to go there because it was dangerous. They didn't even want to explain to her what the danger was. Commoners weren't supposed to know about it, but she didn't like the way the old man reached out to her. So, in anger, she created thorns that pierced the guard's hand. By doing so, she showed that only one person could touch her body. And that was just a small warning. The next time, the man tried to feed the fish. Anne repeated her question about what had happened to the lake. The old man thought she was crazy, and if she was so eager to die, he didn't stop her and told her that the master of the lake had awakened. The Adventurers Guild had sent people, and they had classified him as a lord. The B-rank group was already investigating, so the lake was closed. Anne suggested that this lord had caused the weather anomalies. Nevertheless, the old man asked her to leave, because it would not be good for her if she interfered with the team of adventurers. But before that, he also demanded that the girl leave him 300 a meal for the treatment of the wound she had inflicted, to which she did not refuse, and threw a bag of coins right at his feet, and still intended to go to the lake despite the old man's warnings, and he still did not understand why she was rushing into such danger. The answer was actually simple. It was all for the sake of her love. The group of adventurers was already at the center of events. One of the girls couldn't make up her mind, but at the same time she understood that if she continued to do nothing, everything would be taken away from her. The red-haired beauty had special feelings for someone, so she decided to confess her feelings once they had completed their mission. Someone's voice brought Aluka out of her trance. Their group was in a situation where there was no time to indulge in dreams. Her ally was already in bad shape, so he asked her to use her healing magic on him, otherwise he might not last long. Iluka immediately got to work and summoned the spirit of life, asking it to help her ally with his life force. Something terrible and enormous was approaching, and the group was already on alert. They had to use a mountain of spells to pull Lord Beppo out of the water. Rhodes, probably the strongest among the adventurers, took on the main defense to oppose the Lord. At the same time, he controlled the situation and told Aluka what to do. Aluka was flying around somewhere at the time, but she was definitely not on the battlefield. She didn't know what she was supposed to do, and only got involved when Rhodes told her what to do. Now she had to use her magic attack, and as soon as possible. She may not have been a weak sorceress, but her feelings clouded her mind, and she couldn't feel herself in the moment, constantly drifting away with her thoughts. When the first attack was launched, it was time for the second. Rhodes pierced the Lord with his sword while he was recovering from the previous attack. The young man had to put all his strength into it, so after his attack, he needed time to catch his breath. But after a few minutes, it was as if nothing had happened, and he smiled and rejoiced at the result. Rhodes praised Tia for her excellent work, but did not mention Aluka, who had made a significant contribution. The girl was like a third wheel here. It was clear that she was in love with Rhodes, but he did not seem to reciprocate her feelings. Rhodes continued to praise Tia for how she managed to restrain the Lord. Aluka still couldn't understand why she was so undervalued. Once, when they were children, they promised each other to become the strongest duo of adventurers and to always be together. Aluka had pursued Rhodes for so long, but he never turned to her. She was the first to appear in his world. But in the end, she couldn't even be called a secondary character, because Rhodes immediately fell in love with someone else. While Tia was treating Rhodes's wounds, he suddenly remembered another friend. He said she was standing there frozen, and they needed to go and deal with the master of the lake. She was already ready to move towards them when she heard something strange. A deep roar spread across the lake, piercing the eardrums. Before them stood the true master of Lake Beppo. Tia didn't lose her composure and immediately began to use her explosive magic. But such magic was insignificant compared to the size of the Lord of the Lake. The Lord's attacks were much more powerful, and Aluka caught Rhodes in time to prevent him from falling. Rhodes realized that they could not defeat such a monster, so he ordered Aluka to leave. The guy couldn't leave this place with Aluka because he had taken Tia into the team, so he felt it was his duty to ensure her safety. No matter what the cost, he was ready to pay even with his life. He wanted to die with her if necessary. Rhodes left Aluka and ran straight to Tia, ready to give up his life, and watched all this, seeing with her own eyes a monster of the Lord level. And then she thought that if they were all like that, it would be quite easy for her to get the dragon whip for the young master. Things were bad because the Lord of the Lake had already activated his energy and was ready to attack strangers. Rhodes was already prepared to say goodbye to his life along with his beloved Tia. He understood that they were doomed. Meanwhile, An was trying to take control of the whole situation. She was a powerful enough mage to gain power over the Lord of the Lake. The adventurers were no match for An with the power she possessed. The girl managed to block the Lord's attack by erecting rocks around his huge body. Aluka, who had not fled, could see with her own eyes how a seemingly fragile woman had stopped such a mighty ancient beast. When it seemed like everything was over, Anne asked the girl if she was okay. But Anne did not answer the question of who she was, and only promised that she would kill the monster and protect the adventurers. She decided to use her favorite attack, shackles, against the Lord. Aluka had never seen liquid metal like the one Anne used before. The liquid metal shackles began to pierce the great monster, preventing it from attacking back or even defending itself. The Lord constantly made such strange noises that he scared away all the fish that Anne was going to catch for her young master. This made the girl very angry, and she was not going to stop now. Nothing could stand in the way of her goal. This mistake cost the Lord dearly, and he had to pay for it with his life. After that, the water turned red. The Lord dissolved in his lake for life, his status as Lord taking on a different meaning. Before the eyes of all the adventurers, the Lord-level monster died just like that. When it was all over, Aluka immediately ran to Rhodes to see if he was all right. He was alive, though wounded, but Tia was more seriously injured. Fortunately, the guy had a healing potion in reserve. Meanwhile, he asked Aluka to go to the girl in his place. She had to find out if Anne was an adventurer, if she had a team, and if she wanted to join them. Obviously, Anne was capable of destroying the Lord with a single blow and possessed magic. With her, their team of adventurers would become much stronger, and in the future, they would not find themselves in such a desperate situation. Meanwhile, Anne herself began to collect fish, which was why she had come here in the first place. She did not know what kind of fish the young master wanted to eat, so she wondered what she should collect. She considered this an unacceptable mistake, because as a servant, she should have known by heart what her master's favorite fish was. Aluka heard her words. The girl explained that the two fish in An's hands were inedible. The red one had tough and smelly meat, and the colorful one was very poisonous. The other two fish were more suitable. They were well-known delicacies of Lake Beipo. Aluka knew this well because her home village was located right behind the lake. She came here every fall with her family to fish. Many nobles loved the local fish, and she sold it at a high price. In that case, Anne decided to ask about recipes for these fish, which Aluka kindly shared, and Anne wrote everything down in her notebook. The girl was very grateful to Anne because she had saved them from death, and her recipes were nothing compared to that. Upon learning that Miss Anne had traveled from afar to fish for her beloved, Aluka was surprised at how openly the girl expressed her love, and she was sure that the man was happy. These words made Anne think about it, because she understood that her master was clearly not happy. In any case, he would become even happier when he realized the depth of her love, and thanked Aluka for her help, and was about to leave, but Aluka stopped her, wanting to ask her something else. Aluka had some doubts about love, so she wanted to discuss it with someone as mature as Anne. Anne, in turn, believed that emotions were one of the few complex problems in this world for which there was no clear answer. Nevertheless, she decided to give the girl some time and repay her for the cooking lessons with advice, and share her experience. Aluka began to describe her situation on behalf of her friend. Her friend had a man whom she had loved for a very long time, but her friend couldn't tell if the love was mutual because her partner was slow-witted and kind to everyone around him. In short, he was like a fireplace, radiating warmth and light to everyone. So her friend was going to confess her feelings, but suddenly a new woman appeared. She began to hesitate because the man preferred the new woman. So she started to think about giving up on this idea. It seemed that they loved each other, and childhood love could hardly compare to this. Anne heard Aluka and her problem, so she decided to ask her directly, how much did she love this man? Aluka felt awkward when Anne exposed her, because she was trying to present this situation as coming from someone else, not herself. But it was pointless to hide anything about her emotions, and everything was obvious anyway. Her despair reached such limits that she decided to confess everything, including the fact that she had loved this man since childhood, for more than 10 years. Then Anne asked if Aluka was ready to give her life for him. The girl replied that yes, not only her life, she was ready to do anything for him, even if the whole world was against it. Actually, that was the answer. But what was the point of asking her this if Anne's love was so strong? What did the young lady mean by this? She advised her to follow her true desires, to give everything to the person she loved, and not to make a choice she would later regret. This was Anne's little piece of advice for Aluka's predicament. Follow the desires of your heart? Was it really that simple? Mrs. Aluka's words were imprinted on Aluka's soul and took on a new power over her. Did Aluka really want to give up? Could she really cast aside morality, laws, and life, and then sacrifice everything for one man? Was she ready to give up her place in the sun so easily? Aluka would go mad with jealousy if Rhodes were with someone else. She hated that bitch Tia and wished her death with all her heart. Aluka understood the full meaning of Miss Anne's words. Now all she had to do was act, conquer, and fulfill her secret desires. She had to leave her mark on him. He had to belong to her. Anyone with broken limbs and a collar around their neck would turn into an obedient dog. Aluka didn't know how to do it because Rhodes was much stronger than her. But she didn't need to worry. Anne gave her the power of absolute love. Rhodes was worried about Aluka. He saw that she had suddenly fallen, but even so, he didn't think to go and help her. It seemed to him that the girl had done something to her. Aluka smiled, as if nothing had happened, and said that everything was fine. She had just exhausted her magical power, and was tired. She also said that Anne was a maid in a noble family, so she would not be able to join the adventurers. Rhodes regretted that they hadn't met. He wanted to thank her for saving them, because if she hadn't come to their aid, they wouldn't be alive. Tia was already conscious, and suddenly noticed that there was something strange on Aluka's chest. It looked like a wound, but if you looked closely, it was some kind of mark, probably given to Aluka by Miss Anne without her noticing. But she told her friends that she had simply been hit by the Lord's attack. She also reminded them that it was unsafe here. They didn't know if there was a third Lord in the lake, so the girl suggested returning to the guild to recover and heal Tia. Rhodes agreed with Aluka, picked up Tia, and wanted to carry her to the rest area. Tia was against the guy carrying her. She could walk on her own. But Rhodes didn't accept her whims. She was light, and he could carry her all day long. He saw that the girl had been injured while trying to help him, and he said that in such moments she could rely on him. Such arguments between these guys only angered Aluka, and she was no longer herself. Meanwhile, our hero was bored in the dungeon of his castle. It was already noon the next day. Just then, the maid Anne returned with the promised meal for her master. Moon had already thought that he would not see Anne and would die here alone. Anne thought that her master understood her feelings. But in reality, he was just worried that he might die of hunger. Still, Lake Beipo was very far away, and there were some difficulties. Nevertheless, Anne made every effort to bring back fresh fish. The fish gave off an incredible aroma of spices and meat. The dish itself was steamed and cooked over charcoal, which added a special flavor. First, Moon decided to try the steamed fish. Anne took a piece with a spoon and began to feed her master as if he were a child. Moon, in fact, did not mind. The main thing was to eat his fill. The fish, prepared according to Aluka's recipe, was incredibly delicious, and Moon suggested that Anne try it too. But the girl refused, as it was all for the young master. She also warned him that there were a lot of bones in the fish. But this slightly offended our hero because he felt like a child. And yet, the warning was not in vain, because at that very moment, a bone got stuck in his throat, and felt she had to help her master and was about to kiss him. She decided to pinch his nose and take a deep breath. With her lung capacity, it would be easy to pull the bone out. In short, Anne wanted to suck the bone out with a kiss, and nothing could stop her from doing what she had planned. Anne pressed her lips against her master's and began to try to pull the bone out of his throat. After a few seconds, the job was done. Anne, as promised, really did get the bone out. The bone was very small, but it was enough to cause discomfort in the throat. Moon felt awkward after that, but he still wanted to finish his meal on his own and promised not to choke again. After all, he had become very hungry during all this time, and the food, famous throughout the empire, tasted excellent. When the gentleman had eaten his fill and asked permission to continue what she had started, Moon pretended not to understand her and tried to change the subject. But Anne wanted to fulfill Duke Leopold's request, as he had asked her to give him an heir to the Campbell family as soon as possible. Anne had already begun to undress, and Moon tried to stop her so that it would not happen, at least not now. They had done this so many times during the week that Anne had already thought that she had bored her husband. But he insisted that this was not the case. The thing was, he had just eaten. High activity immediately after eating was harmful to health, and Anne herself was surely tired after the journey. Their child could be born unhealthy if they were not in perfect condition. The fact that Moon was concerned about her health literally stunned Anne. She certainly did not expect to hear such words from him. Therefore, it was decided to postpone it until the next day, and wanted to share something with her master. On the way back, she passed through the city of Sevetisis, which was famous for its textile technologies. There, clothes were sewn for the ruling family and the nobility. So Anne bought a sexy outfit made of her master's favorite black silky material. It was shiny with a small accessory. It was the most popular costume in underground dance halls, called the Bunny Girl. As soon as Moon imagined all this, he felt blood running from his nose. Anne knew his desires well enough, but he denied everything, wanting to present himself to Anne as a decent person, and that he didn't like black lingerie. But the girl couldn't be fooled, because she had cared for him all these years and had seen quite a few romance novels in the locked closet, where there were plenty of characters in black stockings or tights. Or maybe Moon hadn't noticed that she had been wearing them since they had grown up enough. Anne's closet was filled with black clothes because of Moon, but he had no idea that it was all for his sake. He thought that Anne herself preferred them. In the end, our hero had to give in and admit that he really did love black stockings and tights, and thought it was very cute when the young gentleman admitted his preferences. It was time for the girl to go and take care of the things she had missed out on all these days. They agreed to meet that night, and in the meantime, when Anne left, our hero had his own plans. The necessary items had been obtained, and the people had been sent away. The black book showed him that it was now 3 o'clock in the afternoon. According to Anne's schedule from last week, she would finish work at 6 in the evening. 3 hours should be enough for him to carry out his plan. After preparing the fishbone, Moon sat down by the door lock and began to fiddle with it. He also activated his skill, which was a technique for picking locks with a fishbone. When the technique was activated, he felt as if he were in another space. He could see that the lock inside was made up of 12 pins. When he realized this, the technique pushed him out like a foreign body, and he fell to the floor. 12 pins were too many. He had to set each of them in the right position to open the lock. Even a slight deviation would completely reset the entire process. The bone was too fragile. The rebound of the pin could break it, and as a result, the key would be ruined. Moon only had 4 bones of the right length, but that wasn't the main problem. If he failed, a fragment would remain in the lock. He would never be able to pull off this trick again. Moon Campbell had only one chance to escape from this imprisonment. Moon wasted no time and got to work. Every minute counted. Unfortunately, he had already broken the third fishbone, and panic washed over him because there weren't many chances to get out. He worked diligently for an hour and a half, and it seemed to be in vain. Moon could only wish good health and a happy family to the master who made this lock. Suddenly, the black book reappeared, reminding him that time was passing. There was less than an hour left before dinner, and there had been no progress. Besides, there was only one bone left. Nevertheless, Moon decided to take a chance. He had thoroughly studied the 10 pins, so he didn't care that there was little time left or that only the last bone remained. He decided to use the fishbone lock-picking technique to its fullest potential. Meanwhile, the maid's working day was almost over. Anne and Noel were preparing soup in the kitchen using the same fish that Anne had caught yesterday. It was the best fish soup Noel had ever tasted. Nothing could compare to the fish from Lake Baipo. Noel helped Anne a lot with the cooking, and they finished an hour early, for which the girl was grateful to her assistant. Noel was observant and noticed that Anne had recently been learning to cook. The master and mistress had left, and the young master was away at school, so they were the only ones here. In addition, Anne had taken some food with her, and in recent days they had eaten only one fish. So Noel began to suspect that Anne might have a pet, most likely a kitten. Anne's life must have flashed before her eyes, and she was ready to finish Noel off before she could finish speaking. But Noel continued, because she remembered that Mr. Moon did not like small animals because they shed hair, so no one kept cats or dogs. Noel suggested that this could be a minor violation of the mansion's rules. Anne was the head maid, so she couldn't tell anyone. Anne, of course, decided to play along with the girl and asked her to keep all this information a secret. Noel loved fluffy animals, so she immediately agreed to keep it a secret, but asked for permission to see the kitten. Only the kitten was afraid of strangers. But Anne promised to take Noel to see it when the cat was a little older. Fortunately, Anne and Noel managed to avoid any trouble. After all, it would have been difficult for the head maid to discreetly dispose of the maid's body. Still, Noel's words reminded Anne of something. The young gentleman must have been bored, sitting locked up. Anne felt no changes in her body, and even if she got pregnant now, it would take 9 months to give birth to a child. There wouldn't be enough books, so Anne decided to give the young gentleman a small animal so that he wouldn't feel lonely. A cat would be perfect for this role, but what color? Anne thought maybe black like her hair color or golden like his hair color. However, it would be better to ask him directly, and momentarily forgot what she was thinking about, and dropped the tray of food when she saw what had happened in the dungeon. The doors were wide open, and that meant only one thing. The young gentleman had managed to escape after all. The cell was located in the underground sewer system, and it could be said that Anne had a knack for surprises. It was difficult to find your way around this place. There was rubbish everywhere. It was dark and slippery, and you could only find your way by following the wind. But if the memories of the body's owner were to be believed, this place was quite far from the camera and should be safe. Then Moon remembered what the previous owner had been studying. Fortunately, he had mastered the magic of light, which now made Moon's task much easier. When he rushed forward, he felt a kitchen knife pierce the wood right next to his hand. It seemed impossible because he had gone so far that she could not catch up with him. And yet, Anne had more advanced skills in magic, so she had no trouble finding her master. Moon made Anne worry, and that was not a good sign. Of course, she was very unhappy with her master's behavior, but nevertheless tried to remain calm, although it was clear from her eyes that she was very angry. When the young master realized the complexity of the situation, he was overcome with a slight panic. At the same time, he managed to control it and knew his goal. He did not want to return to the cage from which he had escaped, and clearly underestimated Moon. He was not going to give in to her and achieved his will by all possible means. So this time, he decided to use the shadow step he had learned and not care if his feet hurt. Anne, in turn, used the liquid metal control technique she had already practiced on the Lord by the lake. Knives made of liquid metal flew everywhere. Moon had no choice but to run blindly and pray. A barrier in the form of huge wooden furniture appeared in front of Anne. She literally smashed it to smithereens with a single kick. This showed that she possessed not only strong magical power, but also physical strength. All the furniture was in the way of some kind of exit, and noted to herself that the young master was running too fast, and thought that perhaps he had learned some magic at the academy. The maid thought she had prepared thoroughly, but the young gentleman still managed to escape. He exceeded all of Anne's expectations, but even so, he will remain in her hands. If he returns voluntarily, she will turn a blind eye to the incident. Otherwise, the young gentleman would be in for trouble. Moon began to wonder if being imprisoned wasn't so bad after all. He didn't have to worry about food. He was served by a beautiful girl. And although he had lost his freedom, he was still alive. The girl was still somewhere nearby, but she didn't feel any movement in the air. So she decided to go to another place and check something there. After waiting for 10 minutes, Moon felt as if she had left. During that time, he almost had a heart attack and was already preparing for death. That crazy miss must have been looking for him outside, so our hero decided to go out. But as soon as he opened the door, he saw Anne raging. She was smashing all the wooden cabinets one by one in the hope of finding the young gentleman. Thinking that he was not there and that he had managed to escape further away, Anne was upset, but continued her search. After all, Anne would be in serious trouble if Noel or the others found out about this incident. After that, Moon practically breathed his last breath, and then his book suddenly hit him on the head. Such unexpected events could have caused his heart to stop, and the young gentleman would have been no more. Fortunately, it was good that he had learned to control himself. Half an hour had already passed. Anne was probably looking for him outside or guarding the entrance, but in any case, it was too dangerous for our hero to stay here. He had to take a risk and run to another place, using shadow steps. So Moon Campbell ran to the exit, which was again covered by a huge wooden cabinet. When he moved the cabinet, he was able to breathe the air of freedom. It was raining and dark outside, but that didn't stop Moon Campbell from enjoying the moment when he managed to break free. He shouted at the top of his lungs, but it was too early to celebrate, as Anne was likely nearby. He had to leave the mansion's grounds, or even the capital, and get as far away as possible. Moon narrowly escaped a bad end, but judging by Anne's face, the prophecy of the Black Book would come true if he were caught. Moon traveled for 2 days and 2 nights and finally escaped from the capital to the Belran Plains. The morning sun, a light breeze, and the smell of fresh grass. Moon wanted to relax a little, but as soon as he did, fatigue overcame him, so he decided to get some sleep. But it was too early to rest. He had only managed to get away to one town, and Anne would surely find a way to catch up with him. There were 2 possible routes: escape to the Duchy of Campbell or to the Santa Maria Academy. The latter was much closer, so he decided to go to the academy. But as he stood there thinking, he heard screams from the other side of the river. The bandits had cornered a woman and were demanding all her valuables, threatening to harm her if she refused. The girl we knew reminded the bandits that she was an adventurer, and they didn't seem to think about the consequences of stealing her things. The bandits weren't blind and could see that the girl was a mage, but one of them didn't sense any fighting energy from her. They would have already taken off if someone else had been with her, but she was alone. The bandits robbed in broad daylight and were not afraid that a righteous passerby would want to restore justice. They didn't care about anything. They felt powerful and knew they could take whatever they wanted and get away with it. They were professional bandits and proud of their profession. They always came up with a plan in advance and worked out their routes. Their goal was perfectly defined, and they made sure that everything would go smoothly. In fact, that was professionalism. Aluka wanted to get away from the bandits and then attack with magic, which the elder noticed, of course. She was warned that if she took even one step back, she would lose her hands. As for the righteous, the bandits had scouted the area on ordinary days, and no one ever came here, so they couldn't count on a miracle. Moon, who was watching the situation, was not afraid to intervene in the massacre with the bandits. One eyeless bandit even thought our hero was a blonde mermaid, but upon closer inspection, he was just a simple man. Moon was indignant that 3 grown men were bullying a girl. If they wanted something, they could attack him. The bandits agreed to the young gentleman's proposal rather quickly, which surprised him, as he had expected to have to argue with them some more. But in any case, now the beauty could go, the bandits had found a new victim. Moon realized that things were bad. He was weak and couldn't handle 3 men. He admitted that he didn't have any money and suggested that they give him their contact information, so that when he returned home, he could send each of them a couple thousand meals. But who said the bandits wanted to rob him? The idiots passing by were always different from the blue-eyed blondes. If he were a girl, no one would have paid any attention to him. The bandits' plans had changed today. The menu included more intense entertainment. Moon couldn't stop wondering how even in this world there were such scumbags. The bandits ran after Moon and tried to undress him, while Aluka tried to focus and not run away. She had enough time to prepare for the attack, so she summoned the spirit of fire. She commanded it to use the fire explosion technique, which literally saved Moon. The last few days had been difficult and stressful for our hero, with everyone wanting to get their hands on him. He fought for his life and freedom every moment, trying to save someone again, his life flashing before his eyes. Fortunately, the 3 idiots were finished, and now the mermaid could leave her pond. Aluka thanked Moon for distracting them and buying her time. They were in the wilderness, but the girl couldn't understand why Moon was naked. Was this a new pastime for city dwellers, to undress in nature? Moon didn't go into details, but explained that he had good reasons and introduced himself by name and as unemployed. Aluka introduced herself as a former adventuress who was going to become a good wife and mother. Since last night, she was already a wife, and in response, she heard congratulations and wishes for a happy marriage, a long life together, and the speedy birth of a child. But their conversation was interrupted when Aluka heard Moon's stomach growling. The young gentleman admitted that he was hungry and hadn't eaten for 2 whole days. In response, Aluka suggested that he go home with her. She bought groceries to make dinner, and wanted to thank Moon for his help with the bandits. She understood that Moon had exposed himself against his will, and that he could have gotten sick. Aluka was ready to give him her husband's clothes, as they were about the same size. Moon could hardly believe his ears that someone was willing to help him so easily, even with just some old rags. Moon admired this woman, for she surely had a huge, kind heart, and her husband must have accumulated the good fortune of hundreds of lifetimes to marry such a woman. Suddenly, our hero became curious. If Aluka had just gotten married, why was she in this remote area with bandits? The girl was in town on business related to her husband's work and was buying fresh produce. From these words, it became clear to Moon that her husband was also an adventurer. But she and Rhodes decided to take a break, so Aluka went to the guild to report this. Otherwise, they would be declared dead if they didn't show up for a long time. On the way home, the girl asked Moon if he would mind eating fish. Our hero was only too happy to hear this, because he really loved fish, and now, on an empty stomach, he would eat anything. Then the voice of the maid flashed through his mind, telling him that she loved him. Moon, excited, began to look around, worried that Anne had caught up with him. But there was no one around, and Aluka didn't hear any voice, which Moon found strange. Moon attributed his strange behavior to hallucinations from hunger, and when they arrived at Aluka's house, he was surprised that they lived in such a large house. But in fact, it was the headman's house, and she and her husband were living there temporarily. Moon also noticed a very strange detail and wanted to ask about it. As they walked, he noticed that the village was very quiet, and they didn't even meet anyone on the whole way. The doors of all the houses were open. Was no one afraid of being robbed, even though bandits were roaming nearby? Aluka explained this phenomenon by saying that everyone was busy, and asked if the gentleman knew Lake Beipo. It was less than 3 kilometers away. The autumn harvest was approaching, but the village's land was unsuitable for cultivation. Therefore, the village survived by selling fish from the lake to the aristocrats. Aluka and her husband were local adventurers. Her husband was responsible for security and delivering fish for sale, while Aluka stayed here. She believed that he could be compared to the village's protector during this period. In principle, everything sounded logical and did not arouse any suspicion. Moon even thought that it was very difficult, but his thoughts were interrupted when a sinister fog reappeared in his mind. Moon began to look around again to see if Anne was nearby. He couldn't relax and was very tense. Aluka invited him in and offered him slippers, but he heard someone's voice again, and this time it was even louder. Once inside the house, Aluka provided her guest with clothes and water. He could wait for the food to be ready, or wash himself at the well outside. As soon as Aluka left, Moon began to check the water. Everything seemed to him that something was wrong in this place. However, there was no sediment or smell in the water, and no side effects either. It seemed that the water was clean and nothing had been added to it. Of course, there was sense and logic in Miss Aluka's words, and perhaps he even wanted to believe her. But Moon felt very uneasy, as if he were sitting on pins and needles. And it wasn't even because An might be looking for him. It was because of the village. Finally, the food was ready and dinner was over. Moon satisfied his hunger. He admitted that Miss Aluka cooked no worse than his maid. He was sure that she would make a wonderful wife in the future. Aluka admitted that Mr. Moon was an unusual man if he even had a maid. In the end, Moon had to admit that he needed help with this matter. He introduced himself as a representative of the Campbell family, the son of Leopold Ron Campbell. He explained that he was being pursued and wanted to be killed, so he hoped to use Aluka's name to request a carriage or horse from the guild. He needed to send a letter to the duchy and stay here for a while. Aluka's surprise turned to amusement, because she had already thought that he would ask for 300 emil to go to the capital and regain his title. After that, Moon was ready to give the girl 20,000 emil to thank her for her help. Aluka already thought that he wanted to make her the head of the guild or the Countess of Belrond. She took what the man said rather lightly, although she insisted that she understood everything. And yet, for now, she could offer him a place to stay for the night. because wild animals roamed outside the village, and she was ready to give her guest a room. Of course, our hero agreed to this, as it was already a great help to him. Besides, 20,000 was a huge sum, and she could hardly save it up even with 30 orders, so she had no reason to refuse. The whole house was very clean, and Munu had already been given a room. The toilet was behind the well, and Aluka also asked her guest not to wander around the house or open other doors without permission. In particular, the girl emphasized the door at the end of the corridor and also explained there were preparations drying there. Winter was 2 months away, and they had to make jerky before the cold weather set in. Therefore, the smell of blood could spread throughout the house if the door were opened now, and it was impossible to enter the other rooms because the headman would be angry when he returned. Saying goodbye, Moon promised not to wander around the house. After all, he had no reason to do so. He was already very grateful to the girl for helping him so much. Aluka left the master with a sad look and thoughts that the noble master would not live to see the morning. He would simply turn into nothing. The girl already had her own plans for the young lord, and Moon was to become her next victim. The next and last victim of the god of love. Meanwhile, someone was having trouble sleeping, and a certain person was wandering around the outskirts of the city. Out of all the thousands of scraps, and recognized the scent of her young master who had strayed quite far from her. But it was all in vain, because his loyal maid could find him even at the other end of the world. It was not so easy for our hero to escape from Anne's embrace because only a few days had passed, and she had already almost caught up with her beloved. Moon wanted to sleep so badly that he didn't even take off his clothes, immediately passed out, and began to snore. But at one point, he woke up and felt that he needed to go to the toilet. He had drunk too much water because he was thirsty, and now he couldn't sleep. Leaving his room, Moon heard a strange sound like a dog barking, but he couldn't remember seeing any dogs here. Behind him, Aluka was sneaking up and suddenly addressed her guest. The girl laughed innocently when she saw Moon's reaction to her. Of course, she asked why her guest was awake so late. Was something bothering him? Moon was genuinely startled by the surprise and fidgeted awkwardly, but he still had to explain. He got up because he needed to use the bathroom. But he was also interested in one question. Was there really a dog here? Aluka admitted that her sweet and beautiful dog had been there. He was usually obedient, but today he couldn't calm down. So the girl wanted to feed him. Moon exhaled, thinking he had misheard again, and asked permission to see the dog. Our hero loved dogs, especially large golden retrievers. Their fluffy puppies grew up to be smart and kind, and he had always dreamed of having one. Aluka was forced to refuse the request because her dog was very shy, otherwise he would not have hidden in the room. In that case, Moon decided to go where he was going, because his body couldn't wait. Aluka smiled one last time, and reminded him that the toilet was behind the well. But then that smile and kind gaze turned into the most sinister ones. Although the house was large and stately, the toilet was the most ordinary, unremarkable village toilet. In addition, it smelled very bad, and Moon already thought that in this village it was not customary to clean the toilets more often. Still, his main concern was to relieve himself and move on, but then his attention was drawn to a light. The light was on in the same room as Miss Aluki's dog. The dog's barking did not stop, and it was very strange, which our hero forgot to ask the hostess about. Moon thought that nothing terrible would happen if he just peeked through the crack to see the breed of the dog, as he was very curious. But what was happening in the room would shock any sane person. The cheerful Rhodes, Aluka's childhood friend, was chained up like a dog and eating food from the hand of his childhood friend. The guy was hardly in a normal state, but Aluka continued to assure him that her guest was useful to her, and that he should be patient a little longer and she would be able to release him tomorrow. This incredible turn of events literally opened our hero's eyes to everything that was happening, and to the pit he had fallen into once again. Moon accidentally gave himself away with his footsteps, and Aluka immediately glanced at the window. Of course, there was no one else there except them, and the hostess immediately assumed that it was Mr. Moon. Aluka looked out the window, but there was no one there. She thought she must have imagined it. The god of love needed a little more time to wake up. But Aluka still wanted to check on Moon again. Things were bad. Moon had to run away from this place again and save his skin, otherwise he would die even before Anne found him. This Aluka, with her thick eyebrows and large eyes, seemed very friendly to our hero, and this dog resembled the man in the portrait in the hallway. Apparently, it was the same husband. Moon's luck was enviable, as he escaped from the yandere's hands into the clutches of the twisted woman. The village was eerie and empty. The adventuress whose husband was replaced by a dog, and then some god of love appeared, and the strange sounds he heard. All of this was seriously frightening, and asking the guild for help would not work. Therefore, it was necessary to flee from here after all. It was not possible to stay as a guest. Meanwhile, Aluka tried to continue to behave like a hospitable hostess, knocking on the guest's door but hearing no answer. Entering the room without permission, she saw an empty bed and an open window. Out of anger at her failed plan, she broke the nearest wardrobe. The girl was indignant and very angry. She did not understand when this guy had managed to guess her plans. But suddenly she heard a knock on the door and assumed that her precious guest had returned. She immediately ran to open the door with a smile and said that she was worried because Moon had been gone for a long time. But when she looked closely, she saw that it was not Moon standing in front of her, but an old acquaintance. And herself did not expect to see the tearful girl she had become a teacher to. Aluka prepared sweet tea for her guest, and noted that her maid's outfit was very cute. In fact, and simply did not have time to change because she was in a hurry. Besides, she did not understand why Aluka called her a teacher. Had she really taught her something? With a completely innocent smile, Aluka said that thanks to Miss Anne's words, she found the courage to accept her true self and confess to him that same night. Aluka even decided to show what she had managed to do thanks to Anne's advice. The girl agreed without any enthusiasm, and Aluka went to another room to bring her lover. Anne, in turn, was preoccupied with her questions. She felt in her gut that she had not made a mistake about the location. The scent of the young master still lingered in the air. There was no doubt he was here, but that wasn't all. In addition to the young gentleman's scent, the girl also smelled a strong smell of blood. Aluka returned fairly quickly, but her upbringing compelled her to apologize to Miss Anne for the wait. The girl was rarely surprised by anything, but this time she was genuinely shocked when she saw what her new acquaintance showed her. Aluka brought her beloved husband on a leash, and when asked to greet the guest, he simply barked like a dog. In the same way a dog behaves, he gave her his hand when his mistress asked him to give her his paw. Aluka was very happy with her married life. She had an obedient husband. What else did she need to be happy? And Anne saw a certain variety, because she never imagined that spouses could even have such games. She praised her student. But she thought that Rhodes would give himself to his teacher body and soul, because she was far from the level that Anne was at. The maid sincerely praised Aluka, because her leniency and negligence allowed her beloved young master to escape. Upon hearing mention of a young gentleman, Aluka immediately assumed that it was her runaway guest. But rather than speculate, she asked if it was really Mr. Moon Campbell. As soon as she heard the familiar name, she perked up and began asking questions. The girl said that he had spent the night in this room, and when she met him, he was dressed in rags. So she brought him here, fed him, and allowed him to stay. But just a few hours ago she heard a strange noise and decided to check, but there was no one in the room. Mr. Moon hadn't even said goodbye. Aluka decided to help her teacher. She knew the tracking magic that hunters use to find their prey, so she could easily track down Mr. Moon. In the dark, Mr. Moon wouldn't be able to get very far, so Anne just had to wait while Aluka prepared the spell. Before leaving, the girl asked her guest to stay in this room and not wander into other rooms, because it was not her home. Anne agreed without hesitation and stayed in Moon's room, thinking about him. She sniffed the pillow he had slept on, and wondered why he hated her so much that he had managed to escape through 3 cities. Why couldn't he just accept her love? But Anne couldn't stay alone when she heard Aluki's man barking. The once handsome guy had turned into a shadow of a man. His dull gaze spoke volumes instead of the words he couldn't say. But in an instant, he simply couldn't take it anymore and screamed at the top of his lungs. It seemed as if he had some kind of headache. He uttered Tia's name and shouted, "Don't!" And then he said Aluki's name. Anne couldn't ignore the situation and tried to help the guy in any way she could. Rhodes grabbed Anne's hand and said he was fine, but then he said Aluki's name again. In some kind of frenzied fear, he mentioned the last room and told Anne to run away from there. After that, it was as if his ability to speak had been taken away, and he immediately fell silent. He lost all emotion again and lowered his gaze as if nothing had happened, and decided to listen to Rhodes and went to the last room. It was locked, but it was easy for Anne to open the lock with her magic. As soon as she opened the door, a disgusting smell of blood wafted out of the room. The smell literally hit Anne's nose, making it difficult to breathe. But what she saw in front of her surprised her even more. There were many corpses of people, residents of this now empty village. Their bones from rotting bodies were scattered everywhere, and at the center of it all, a girl with snow-white but bloodied hair was tied to a cross. Tia. Tia did not look alive, and it was unlikely that she could survive after such torture, which her friend had once inflicted on her. It was obvious that Aluka had arranged all this. Anne had seen it all, but even this made her tense up. Aluka, of course, quickly discovered that someone had entered the secret room, and she had to reveal everything. But the girl didn't see anything wrong with that. Her teacher must have understood everything, because they were birds of a feather. Love drove the girl crazy. She became insane, simply following her desires, no matter how sane they were, and fully assessed the situation and took up a fighting stance. It was clear and obvious that the girl had already been defiled by a dark and evil deity, who had left a dark mark on her soul and body forever. But in response to this remark, Aluka just laughed like a madwoman. She asked the teacher to show more respect for the god of love. After all, he was so kind to her that he gave her the strength to help her give love to others. And he didn't ask for anything in return. God simply allowed her to see her true essence. Aluka believed that she and Anne were kindred spirits. Besides, she needed one last person for her sacrifice. Was Anne ready to accept Aluka's love? And yet, and had common sense, she understood that the situation was too hopeless. Aluka thought she had met with her teacher's understanding, so she promised her that the incision would be neat. But how foolish and blinded by her desires was that girl who thought that someone would give her their life. Anne didn't even give Aluka time to react before she slit her throat. It was quick and painless. But even before her death, Aluka still wondered why her teacher had done this to her. Be that as it may, Anne's soul was at peace knowing that this crazy girl would never hurt anyone again. Even before her death, she couldn't admit that she had hurt anyone. She believed that she was giving love and saw nothing wrong with it, and was very angry and literally yelled at Aluka, making it clear that it was not love. And yet, before her death, Aluka wanted to understand if it wasn't love, then what is love? Anne taught Aluka to take everything from her loved one, and she followed her advice. Did she misunderstand her teacher? Disappointed, Anne couldn't answer her question, simply apologized and left. It was too late to explain anything. The spirit had left the body. Or maybe Anne herself didn't understand what love was. Anne felt guilty. She knew that the contract with the evil god would bring perverted love that would kill her beloved. It was all her fault. If it weren't for her teachings, maybe that innocent girl wouldn't have become what she was and killed so many people. So Anne decided that as soon as she found the young master, she would bury Aluka in a fitting manner. As soon as she left the building, the girl immediately heard strange voices affirming love and saw a red haze coming from all the cracks. It became clear that this was the manifestation of an evil god, because Anne had personally brought the last sacrifice that Aluka had so sought. Meanwhile, the young gentleman ran at full speed and did not even think to stop for a moment. But when he had run a long enough distance, he decided to stop and catch his breath, hoping that no one would find him at such a distance. But no sooner had he thought this than he heard someone's hurried footsteps behind him. He only had time to turn around when lightning flashed near him, splitting a tree in two. Moon didn't quite understand what had just happened, and what kind of meteorite had flown past him, leaving such traces. Listening closely, he heard a human voice clearing its throat not far from him. As soon as the dust settled, he saw his maid and the source of his problems, Anne, by the tree. The girl was clearly in bad shape and was trying to catch her breath. A spark of hope appeared in her eyes when she saw the young master, confirming her guess that she was right when she thought he was nearby. Anne was happy to have found her beloved, but Moon did not run away as usual. He was concerned about the girl's condition and did not understand who she had been fighting with to sustain such injuries. Now was not the time for conversation. No matter how much they both wanted it, the girl ordered the young gentleman to flee from there, while she would stop the danger. A terrifying voice pursued Anne, calling her teacher and confessing his love for her. The huge red monster demanded that Anne accept his love and merge with him,